She thought telling him the truth would drive him away, that confessing she'd killed a man would make the cowboy run like all the others. But when Clara Wynne finally spoke the words she'd buried for a year, Elias Boone didn't flinch. He didn't judge. Instead, he stepped closer, his calloused hands reaching for hers, and whispered the words that would change everything. This is their story, a tale of redemption, danger, and love born in the shadows of the Old West. Stay until the end and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. The winter wind screamed through Montana territory like a wounded animal, rattling the shutters of the Silver Spur Saloon and sending icy fingers through every crack in the weathered walls. Inside, Clara Wynne moved through the empty room with practiced efficiency, her broom scraping against floorboards that had seen too many boots, too much whiskey, and too many secrets. The sound was rhythmic, almost meditative, a heartbeat she couldn't silence, a penance she couldn't escape. It was December of 1876, and the town of Copper Ridge huddled against the base of the Rocky Mountains like a child seeking shelter from a storm it couldn't understand. The settlement was barely 5 years old, a collection of wooden buildings thrown together by prospectors, ranchers, and people running from something or someone. Clara understood that last category intimately. She paused in her sweeping, her breath visible in the cold air despite the potbelly stove glowing weakly in the corner. Through the frosted window, she could see Main Street, if you could call it that, buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. The afternoon light was already fading, turning the world outside into shades of gray and white, beautiful and merciless in equal measure. Clara was 24 years old, though she felt decades older. Her auburn hair was pinned back in a simple bun, revealing a face that men called beautiful and women called trouble. High cheekbones, full lips, and eyes the color of summer grass, eyes that held shadows no amount of Montana sunshine could burn away. She wore a simple brown dress with a white apron, the uniform of her station, though the way she carried herself suggested she hadn't always worked in saloons. "You're here late again," came a voice from the doorway to the back room. Clara turned to see Maggie Sullivan, the saloon's owner, emerging with a crate of glasses. Maggie was a formidable woman in her 50s, with iron gray hair and a spine like tempered steel. She'd built the Silver Spur from nothing after her husband died in a mining accident, and she ran it with a firm hand and a surprisingly kind heart. "Just finishing up," Clara said, resuming her sweeping. "Wanted to make sure everything's ready for tonight." "Tonight's going to be slow," Maggie observed, setting the crate on the bar with a heavy thunk. "Nobody's going out in this storm unless they're desperate or stupid." "That describes half our clientele," Claire replied, and Maggie barked out a laugh. "Fair point." The older woman studied Claire with eyes that missed nothing. "You doing all right, girl?" It was a question Maggie asked regularly, always casual, always concerned. Clara had appeared in Copper Ridge 13 months ago, stepping off the supply wagon with a single carpet bag and a request for work. She told Maggie she was a widow from Denver, that her husband had died of consumption, that she needed a fresh start. All lies, of course, but lies told so convincingly that even Clara sometimes believed them. "I'm fine," Clara said, which was her standard answer. Maggie didn't look convinced, but she didn't press. That was one of the things Clara appreciated about her. Maggie understood that everyone had a past, and that past wasn't always fit for sharing. The front door burst open with such force that both women jumped. Snow swirled into the room like angry ghosts, and with it came a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy coat that made him look even larger. For a terrifying moment, Clara's heart stopped, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife she kept tucked in her boot. But then the figure pushed back his hat, revealing a face that made Clara's breath catch for entirely different reasons. He was handsome in the way of men carved from the frontier itself, strong jaw dusted with several days' worth of stubble, sun-weathered skin, and eyes the color of a clear sky at dawn. Those eyes swept the room, taking in every detail with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent years reading situations for threats before landing on Clara. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice a low drawl that carried the warmth of Texas. "This establishment still serving, or am I too late?" Maggie recovered first. "We're open. Come on in before you let all the heat out." The stranger stepped inside and closed the door behind him, stomping snow from his boots. As he unwound a scarf from his neck, Clara noticed several things. The way he moved with deliberate care, like a man who knew his own strength and didn't want to break things by accident. the quality of his coat, which suggested he had money despite his rough appearance, and most importantly, the gun belt visible when his coat fell open, well-worn leather holding a Colt Peacemaker that had clearly seen use. "What can we get you?" Maggie asked, moving behind the bar with professional ease. "Coffee, if you've got it." The stranger pulled off his gloves, revealing hands that bore old scars across the knuckles. "Been riding since dawn, and I'm about frozen through." "Coffee we've got." Maggie glanced at Clara. "Would you mind? Pot should still be hot from this afternoon." Clara nodded, grateful for something to do with her hands. She headed to the back room, her mind racing. There was something about the stranger that set her on edge. Not danger exactly, but awareness. Like every nerve in her body had suddenly woken up after a long sleep. When she returned with a steaming mug, the stranger had settled at a table near the stove, his coat draped over an empty chair. He'd removed his hat too, revealing dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar. He looked up as she approached, and again their eyes met, really met, and Clara felt something shift inside her chest, like a door she'd locked tight suddenly cracking open. "Here you are," she said, setting the mug down carefully, making sure their fingers didn't touch. "Much obliged." He wrapped both hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. "Been a cold ride." "Where are you coming from?" The question slipped out before Clara could stop it. She usually avoided conversation with customers, especially men, but something about him invited questions. "South," he said, which told her nothing. Then, after a sip of coffee, he added, "Been working on a ranch down near Helena. Contract ended. Figured I'd move on before winter really sets in." His lips quirked in a half smile. "Though I might have miscalculated on that." "Montana winters don't wait for anyone," Clara said, echoing something Maggie had told her the year before. "So I'm learning." He took another drink, his eyes never leaving her face, not in a way that felt invasive, but interested, like he was trying to read a story written in a language he didn't quite speak. "I'm Elias. Elias Boone." Clara hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Giving her name always felt dangerous, even though she'd been using it for over a year without consequence. "Clara Wynne." "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Wynne." His formality was old-fashioned, almost courtly, at odds with his rough exterior. "Mrs." Clara corrected automatically, maintaining her widow fiction. Something flickered in his eyes, sympathy, perhaps, or understanding. "My condolences." Before Clara could respond, the door opened again, this time admitting a blast of wind and 3 men Clara recognized. Bill Hastings and his sons, ranchers from north of town. They were regulars, mostly harmless but loud, especially after they'd been drinking. "Well, hell," Bill boomed, shaking snow from his shoulders. "Thought we'd be the only fools out tonight." Maggie laughed from behind the bar. "Can't keep the Hastings boys away from my whiskey, apparently. Your usual?" As Maggie poured drinks and the Hastings settled in at the bar, Clara felt herself relax slightly. More people meant less chance of extended conversation with the stranger, with Elias. She could retreat to the background, sweep some more, maybe help Maggie with glasses. Safe. Anonymous. But when she turned back to Elias's table to collect his empty mug, he was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Will you be staying in Copper Ridge long?" she found herself asking, again against her better judgment. "Depends," he said. "Looking for work, horse trading, ranch work, security. I've done a bit of everything. You know anyone hiring?" "Might ask at the general store," Clara suggested. "Mr. Peterson knows everyone's business. Or the telegraph office. Sometimes ranchers post notices there." "Appreciate the advice." He stood, pulling coins from his pocket and leaving them on the table. More than the coffee cost. "I'll get out of your way. Thank you for the warmth." "You're welcome to stay," Clara said, then immediately regretted it. What was she doing? She didn't encourage men to linger. "I mean, it's cold out, and we'll have food soon if you're hungry." Elias studied her for a long moment, and Clara had the unsettling feeling that he could see right through her, through the careful walls, the practiced smiles, the widow story she'd crafted so carefully. But instead of pressing, he simply nodded. "Maybe I will then." He settled back into his chair, and Clara retreated to the bar, her heart beating faster than it should. Maggie caught her eye and raised an eyebrow, but Clara just shook her head and grabbed a rag to wipe down the bar top. The evening progressed slowly. A few more customers trickled in, seeking refuge from the cold and the boredom of being snowed in. Maggie served drinks, Claire kept busy with cleaning and serving stew when customers wanted food, and Elias Boone sat by the stove, nursing a second cup of coffee and occasionally exchanging words with other patrons. But Clara was aware of him constantly, aware of how he laughed at Bill Hastings' jokes, aware of how his eyes tracked her movements around the room, aware of how different he seemed from the rough cowboys and miners who usually populated the Silver Spur. There was a stillness to him, a core of calm that suggested he'd seen violence and chosen peace. Around 8 o'clock, the Hastings boys started getting rowdy. It wasn't unusual, they were good men, but whiskey made them stupid. Bill's younger son, Tommy, began pestering one of the other saloon girls, Annie, following her around and making increasingly crude comments. "Come on, Annie, just one dance," Tommy slurred, grabbing her arm. "Let go," Annie said firmly, trying to pull away. But Tommy's grip tightened. Before Clara could move, before Maggie could even set down the glass she was polishing, Elias was there. He didn't rush. There was nothing aggressive in his movement, but suddenly he was standing beside Tommy, one hand resting lightly on the younger man's shoulder. "Friend," Elias said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume, "the lady asked you to let go." Tommy spun, ready to argue, but whatever he saw in Elias's face made him reconsider. Maybe it was the absolute calm in those blue eyes, or maybe it was the way Elias stood, relaxed but ready, like a coiled spring. But Tommy released Annie's arm and stepped back. "Didn't mean nothing," he mumbled. "I'm sure you didn't," Elias replied, still calm. "But you're going to apologize now." "Sorry, Annie," Tommy said, suddenly finding his boots fascinating. Annie nodded stiffly and hurried toward the back room. Elias returned to his table as if nothing had happened, but Clara saw Bill Hastings watching him with new respect, and maybe a little wariness. Later, after the Hastings had left and the saloon was nearly empty, Clara found herself cleaning tables near where Elias sat. He'd taken out a small book and was reading by lamplight, his coffee long since gone cold. "Thank you," Clara said quietly. "For helping Annie." Elias looked up, marking his place with one finger. "Didn't like seeing a woman treated that way. Not every man would have stepped in. Then not every man was raised right." He closed the book. Clara caught a glimpse of the title, The Odyssey. "Homer?" she said before she could stop herself. "You read Greek classics?" Something like pleasure crossed his face. "You know it?" Clara caught herself, but it was too late. The widow from Denver in her story wouldn't necessarily know Homer. But Celeste Morgan, the woman she'd been before, the daughter of a successful San Francisco merchant, educated at the finest schools, she would know. "I read a little," she finished lamely. "When I was younger." Elias studied her with those two perceptive eyes. "It's a good story. Man trying to get home after a war, facing all kinds of troubles. Sometimes I feel a kinship with old Odysseus, always traveling, never quite finding the place I'm supposed to be." There was something melancholy in his voice, something that resonated with Clara's own rootlessness. "Maybe home isn't a place," she heard herself say. "Maybe it's more like a feeling, something you carry with you. Or something you've lost and are trying to find again," Elias added softly. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Clara felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. Recognition. This man, this stranger, somehow understood the particular kind of loneliness that came from running, from being separated from the person you used to be. The moment was broken by Maggie announcing last call. The remaining customers, just two old miners playing cards, drained their drinks and headed out into the night. Clara helped Maggie close up, acutely aware of Elias gathering his things, preparing to face the cold. "You got somewhere to stay?" Maggie asked him. "Boarding house down the street is clean and cheap." "I'll find it," Elias said, pulling on his coat. "Thank you for the hospitality." He tipped his hat to both women, his eyes lingering on Clara for just a moment longer, and then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click. "Well," Maggie said into the silence. "That was interesting." Clara focused on wiping down the bar. "What do you mean?" "Don't play dumb with me, girl. That man looked at you like you were water, and he'd been walking through a desert. You're imagining things." "Am I?" Maggie's voice was gentle. "And what about how you looked at him?" Clara's hand stilled on the rag. I don't know what you're talking about. All right. Maggie didn't sound convinced, but she let it drop. Go on home. I'll finish up here. You sure? Go. You've been working yourself ragged lately. Get some rest. Clara didn't argue. She hung up her apron, pulled on her own coat, threadbare compared to Elias's, but warm enough, and stepped out into the night. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. The storm had calmed to a steady snowfall, fat flakes drifting down from an invisible sky. Main Street was deserted, all the buildings dark except for a few lit windows at the boarding house and the saloon behind her. Clara's room was above the general store, a tiny space that Mr. Peterson rented to her for almost nothing in exchange for occasional help in the store. It wasn't much. A narrow bed, a washstand, a small table with one chair, and a trunk that held everything she owned. But it was hers, and it was safe. Or it had been, until tonight. As Clara climbed the exterior stairs to her room, her mind kept returning to Elias Boone, to the way he'd intervened with Tommy Hastings, to the quiet intensity in his eyes, to the book of Homer he carried, to the scars on his hands and the well-worn gun at his hip, to the dangerous feeling of being seen for the first time in over a year. Inside her room, Clara lit the lamp and sat on her bed, not bothering to undress. Through the thin walls, she could hear the wind, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barking. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. But Clara didn't feel safe. She felt exposed, like Elias Boone had somehow looked at her and glimpsed the truth she'd worked so hard to hide. It was ridiculous. He was just a stranger passing through, a cowboy looking for work. Tomorrow he'd find a job on some ranch and ride out of her life as quickly as he'd entered it. That should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like loss. Clara pulled off her boots and lay back on the bed, still fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind drifted, as it often did in quiet moments, to the past she'd tried so hard to bury. San Francisco, nearly 2 years ago. She'd been Celeste Morgan then, the beloved daughter of Thomas Morgan, owner of Morgan & Sons Shipping. She'd lived in a beautiful house on Nob Hill, worn silk dresses, attended the opera. She'd been engaged to Richard Ashford, a successful attorney from an equally successful family. Her future had been golden, perfect, exactly what everyone expected. Until the night Richard had shown her who he really was. They'd been at his family's estate for dinner. His parents had retired early, leaving them alone in the parlor. Richard had been drinking, not drunk, but loose, uninhibited. He'd started touching her despite her protests, his hands rough and insistent. "We're getting married in 3 months," he'd said, his breath hot against her neck. "What difference does it make if we start now?" "Richard, stop." But he hadn't stopped. He'd pushed her against the wall, his body pinning hers, one hand fumbling with her dress, while the other covered her mouth to muffle her protests. And in that moment, Celeste Morgan had realized that this man, this respected attorney, this pillar of society, saw her as property he'd already purchased. So she'd fought back. The details were burned into her memory, her hand finding the heavy brass candlestick on the nearby table, the solid thunk as it connected with Richard's temple, his look of shock as he stumbled backward, the sickening crack as his head hit the marble fireplace hearth, and then the blood. So much blood. Celeste had stood there, frozen, the candlestick still in her hand, watching Richard Ashford lie motionless on his family's expensive carpet. She'd waited for him to move, to breathe, to get up and attack her again. He hadn't moved. The panic had come then, overwhelming and absolute. She hadn't intended to kill him. She'd just wanted him to stop, to get off her, to see her as a person instead of a possession. But intentions didn't matter with a body cooling on the floor and blood on her hands. She'd run. Not home. She couldn't face her father, couldn't see the disappointment and shame in his eyes. Instead, she'd gone to her room above the carriage house, grabbed what money she had, changed into a simple dress, and disappeared into the San Francisco night. For 2 months, she'd stayed in the city, hiding in cheap boarding houses, changing locations frequently, reading newspapers that screamed about Richard Ashford's murder and the search for his missing fiancée. The stories had been horrible, suggesting she'd killed him for money, that she'd been having an affair, that she'd always been unstable. Richard's family had painted her as a monster, and society had believed them. Finally, when the search had grown too intense, she'd used the last of her money to book passage on a ship heading north. She'd disembarked in Seattle, worked for 3 months in a boarding house, then joined a family heading inland. By the time she'd reached Montana territory, she was Clara Wynn, widow, looking for a fresh start. And for 13 months, that fresh start had worked. She'd kept her head down, worked hard, avoided attention. She'd built a quiet life in Copper Ridge, where no one asked too many questions and the past stayed buried under snow and distance. Until tonight, when a blue-eyed stranger had walked into the Silver Spur and looked at her like he could see all the secrets she carried. Clara rolled onto her side, pulling the thin blanket around her shoulders. Tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow Elias Boone would be just another customer, if he came back at all. Tomorrow she'd remember to keep her walls up, to maintain her distance, to protect the fragile safety she'd built. Tomorrow. But that night, Clara dreamed of blue eyes and calloused hands, and the dangerous feeling of being known. Morning came too soon, announced by pale light filtering through the thin curtains and the sound of wagons rattling over frozen ground. Clara rose, washed in cold water from the basin, and dressed in another simple work dress, this one a faded blue. She pinned her hair up carefully, studying her reflection in the small, cracked mirror on the wall. The face that looked back at her was her own, but also a stranger's. The fashionable young woman of San Francisco was gone, replaced by someone harder, more careful. The green eyes were the same, but they held a wariness now, a constant calculation of risk. Clara made her way down the stairs and across the street to the Silver Spur. The sun was just cresting the mountains, painting the snow-covered town in shades of pink and gold. It was beautiful, achingly so, and Clara let herself pause for just a moment to appreciate it. These moments of peace were rare and precious. Inside the saloon, Maggie was already up, starting a fire in the stove and setting out cups for morning coffee. She looked up when Clara entered, her weathered face breaking into a smile. "Morning, girl. Sleep well?" "Well enough," Clara lied. "What needs doing?" They fell into their morning routine. Clara swept yesterday's tracked-in snow and dirt. Maggie prepared coffee and checked their food supplies. Together, they wiped down tables and arranged chairs. It was mindless work, soothing in its predictability. Around 8 o'clock, the door opened and their first customer of the day walked in. It was Elias Boone. Clara's hands stilled on the table she was wiping. He looked different in the morning light. The stubble on his jaw a little darker, his coat still damp from snow, but those blue eyes just as penetrating. "Morning," he said, addressing both women but looking at Clara. "Any chance I could trouble you for breakfast? Haven't eaten since yesterday." "Of course," Maggie said warmly. "We've got eggs, bacon, and biscuits. Coffee's fresh, too." Sounds like heaven. Elias took the same table by the stove that he'd occupied the night before, and Clara realized with a start that it was becoming his table in her mind, claimed by a single evening's occupancy. As Maggie headed to the back room to cook, Clara had no choice but to bring Elias his coffee. Their fingers brushed as she set down the mug, and she felt a spark. Not romantic, or at least not only romantic, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. Kinship. "You find a place at the boarding house?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. "I did. Mrs. Kowalski runs a tight ship." He smiled, and it transformed his face from merely handsome to something approaching beautiful. "She reminds me of my mother. Same way of looking at you like she knows you're hiding vegetables under your napkin." Clara found herself smiling back before she could stop herself. "Where's your mother?" "Texas. Small town called Sweetwater, down near Abilene." The smile faded a bit. "Haven't seen her in near 5 years." "That's a long time." "It is." He took a sip of coffee, his eyes distant. "Had my reasons for leaving. Still do, I suppose. But I miss her. Miss home." There was that word again. Home. Clara wondered what it would feel like to have a place and people she could return to. Her father was still in San Francisco, as far as she knew, but he might as well be on the moon. She couldn't go back there. Could never go back. "What about you?" Elias asked, pulling her from her thoughts. "You're not from Montana originally. I can hear it in your voice." Clara's guard went up immediately. "What do you hear?" "Education. Good education. The kind that costs money." He wasn't accusatory, just observant. Doesn't fit with the widow from Denver story, does it? Clara's blood ran cold. I don't know what you mean. Easy, Elias said softly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. I'm not trying to start trouble. Just, I recognize the look of someone running from something. Takes one to know one. I'm not running from anything. All right. He didn't argue, but he also didn't look convinced. Then you're just a woman who likes fresh starts. Nothing wrong with that. Before Clara could respond, Maggie emerged with a plate piled high with food. The conversation shifted to safer topics: the weather, town gossip, work prospects. Elias mentioned he'd heard about a ranch west of town that might be hiring for winter work, and Maggie confirmed that the Larson spread was always looking for reliable hands. As the morning progressed, more customers trickled in. Copper Ridge might have been small, but it had enough residents to keep the Silver Spur busy during breakfast hours. Clara served coffee and food, wiped tables, and tried not to notice how often her eyes drifted to the table by the stove where Elias sat reading his Homer. Around 10 o'clock, a disturbance outside drew everyone's attention. Raised voices, then a woman's scream. Clara rushed to the window, her heart hammering, that old instinct to flee rising up like a wild animal. But it wasn't lawmen from San Francisco. It was Mary Chen, who ran the laundry service, arguing with a man Clara recognized as Jake Mercer, a cattle rancher with a reputation for meanness and a drinking problem. You owe me for 3 weeks' washing, Mary was saying, her accent thick but her voice firm. I won't do no more until you pay. I'll pay you when I damn well feel like it, Mercer snarled. He was a big man, gone to fat but still dangerous, with small mean eyes and a mouth like a knife wound. Or maybe I won't pay at all. What are you going to do about it, you little... The racial slur that followed made Clara flinch. Several men on the street had stopped to watch, but none moved to help. That was the way of things. Folks didn't interfere in other people's business, especially when someone like Mercer was involved. But then Elias Boone was walking past Clara, out the door, into the confrontation. Problem here? He asked, his voice carrying that same dangerous calm from the night before. Mercer turned, his face already red with anger. This ain't your business, stranger. You're harassing a woman on the street, Elias said. That makes it everyone's business. The Chinaman's my laundress. I can talk to her however I want. Mrs. Chen, Elias corrected, is a businesswoman you owe money to. Seems to me you should pay your debts like a man of honor would. Clara watched from the doorway, her heart in her throat. This was a mistake. Mercer was connected, had friends, would make trouble for anyone who crossed him. But Elias stood his ground, relaxed but ready, and Clara was reminded again that this was a man who'd seen violence, who knew how to navigate it. You calling me dishonorable? Mercer took a step forward, his hand dropping to his gun belt. I'm saying pay the lady what you owe her. Elias's voice had gotten quieter, which somehow made him more intimidating. Do that, and we can all go about our day. For a long moment, no one moved. The street had gone silent, everyone watching, waiting to see if this would turn into a gunfight. Clara realized she was holding her breath. Then Mercer spat in the snow and pulled out a crumpled wad of bills. He threw them at Mary's feet. There. Now get out of my sight. He stalked off down the street, and slowly the tension dissolved. The crowd dispersed, returning to their business. Elias bent and picked up the bills, handing them to Mary with a small bow. Thank you, Mary said quietly. Thank you so much. Nobody should be treated that way, Elias replied. You all right? Mary nodded, clutching the money, and hurried back to her laundry. Elias stood in the street for a moment, watching Mercer's retreating back, and Clara saw something in his expression. Not pride in what he'd done, but weariness, like this was a scene he'd witnessed too many times. When he came back inside, several patrons nodded to him in respect. Maggie gave him a free refill of coffee, which he accepted with thanks. But when he returned to his table, Clara noticed his hands were shaking slightly. She waited until most of the breakfast crowd had cleared, then brought him fresh coffee unasked. That was brave, she said quietly. Or foolish. Maybe both. Couldn't just stand by, Elias replied. My mother raised me better than that. Mercer's got friends. He'll remember this. Let him. There was steel in his voice now. I've dealt with worse men than Jake Mercer. Clara believed him. Everything about Elias Boone suggested a history she couldn't quite parse. The educated speech mixed with cowboy drawl, the expensive coat over worn clothes, the skill with which he'd de-escalated both situations. Who was this man? You asked if I was running from something, Clara said, the words emerging before her rational mind could stop them. Elias looked up, his blue eyes sharp. What if I said yes, she continued. What if I told you I had reasons for being here, for not wanting questions asked? Then I'd say welcome to the club. His smile was sad. Half the people in the territories are running from something, Clara. The question is whether you're running from something you did or something that was done to you. It was such a perfect distinction, one she'd never articulated even to herself. Running from her crime, yes, but also from Richard's assault, from her father's expectations, from a society that would have blamed her for fighting back. Both, she whispered. Elias nodded slowly. Yeah, that sounds about right. They sat in silence for a moment, and Clara felt that dangerous connection strengthen. This man understood. He'd looked at her and seen not just the lies she told, but the reasons she told them. I was a Texas Ranger, Elias said suddenly. 5 years down on the border. Saw a lot of bad things. Did some too, in the name of justice. He stared into his coffee cup. Last year, I tracked a man, outlaw named Jim Carson. Killed 3 people in a bank robbery, one of them a little girl. I found him hiding at his sister's place, and he went for his gun. Clara waited, not daring to breathe. I shot him, Elias continued, his voice flat. Dead before he hit the ground. But afterward, I found out the sister had lied. Jim hadn't gone for his gun at all. He'd been reaching for a letter, something to show his innocence. Turned out he hadn't killed that little girl. His partner had, and Jim was trying to turn himself in, work out a deal. That wasn't your fault, Clara said. Wasn't it? I was so sure I was right, so certain I was the good guy. He laughed bitterly. Turned in my badge the next week. Couldn't wear it anymore, knowing what I'd done. Been drifting ever since, looking for, hell, I don't know, forgiveness maybe, or just a place where the past doesn't follow. Clara understood that last sentiment intimately. Does such a place exist? Thought maybe Montana in winter might come close, cold enough to freeze the memories. He looked up at her, and his eyes were full of shared pain. But I'm learning that's not how it works. No, Clara agreed softly. It's not. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken understanding. Here were 2 people carrying guilt, both running from their pasts, both trying to find a way forward. Clara had spent over a year avoiding exactly this kind of connection. It was dangerous. It made her visible. It could get her caught. But God, it felt good to be seen. The rest of the day passed in a strange haze. Elias left around noon to visit the Larson Ranch, and Clara threw herself into work, trying to ignore the hollow feeling his absence created. She scrubbed floors that didn't need scrubbing, reorganized supplies that were already organized, anything to keep her hands and mind busy. Maggie watched her with knowing eyes, but said nothing. Evening brought the usual crowd, miners and cowboys, a few families, the regulars seeking warmth and company. Clara served drinks and food, smiled when appropriate, maintained the careful distance she'd perfected. But part of her mind was elsewhere, wondering if Elias would return, wondering what it meant that she hoped he would. Just before closing time, the door opened, and there he was, snow dusting his shoulders, a tired smile on his face. Got the job, he announced to the room in general, and several patrons called out congratulations. The Larson Ranch was well respected, and work there meant steady pay through the winter. That's wonderful, Maggie said, pouring him a celebratory whiskey. When do you start? Monday. Gives me a few days to get settled, pick up supplies. He accepted the drink, but his eyes found Clara. Thought I'd celebrate with one more good meal before I'm eating ranch food. We've got beef stew tonight, Clara said, her voice steadier than her heartbeat. Maggie's recipe. It's good. I'll take it. As Clara brought him his food, Elias caught her wrist gently. His calloused fingers were warm against her skin. Thank you, he said quietly, for this morning, for listening. You listened too, Claire replied. Maybe that's what we both needed. Someone willing to listen without judging. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice, and pulled away before the contact could become conspicuous. But for the rest of the evening, she felt the ghost of his touch on her wrist, warm as a brand. The night wound down. Customers filtered out into the cold. Maggie started closing procedures, humming something under her breath. And Elias Boone sat by the stove, reading his Homer, occasionally glancing up at Clara with eyes full of questions he wasn't asking. Finally, only he remained. "I should go," he said, closing his book. "You ladies need to close up." "It's all right," Maggie said, wiping down the bar. "Take your time." "Clara, why don't you sit for a minute? You've been on your feet all day." It was such an obvious setup that Clara almost laughed. But she was tired, and her feet did hurt, and the idea of sitting across from Elias Boone for just a few more minutes was too tempting to resist. She sat. "Tell me something true, Clara," Elias said, echoing his words from the night before. "Something real." Clara thought about all the truths she could tell. About Richard Ashford and the blood on the carpet. About her father, who probably thought she was dead. About the nightmares that still woke her in the dark hours before dawn. Instead, she said, "I'm tired of running." It was true, she realized as she said it, bone-deep true. She was exhausted from looking over her shoulder, from editing every word, from being only half a person. "Yeah," Elias said softly. "Me too." They sat in companionable silence, the fire in the stove crackling, Maggie moving around the room with deliberate slowness to give them space. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through eaves, and Clara thought about how winter in Montana was like being suspended in ice. Everything frozen, waiting, holding its breath. But maybe, just maybe, spring would come eventually. And maybe, just maybe, when it did, she wouldn't be alone. The days that followed took on a rhythm that both comforted and terrified Clara. Each morning, Elias would appear at the Silver Spur just as she was setting out cups for coffee, his presence as reliable as sunrise. He'd take his table by the stove, order breakfast, and they'd exchange words, careful at first, then gradually more honest. He told her about his childhood in Texas, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about his mother's herb garden and his father's quiet strength before consumption took him. Clara found herself sharing, too, small truths wrapped in the fiction of her widow story, talking about books she'd read and places she'd seen, careful never to mention San Francisco directly, but unable to completely hide the cultured woman she'd once been. On the fourth morning, Elias brought her something, a small book with a worn leather cover. Clara took it carefully, turning it over in her hands. The title was stamped in fading gold, Sonnets from the Portuguese by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. "Found it at the general store," Elias said, a hint of color rising in his weathered cheeks. "Mr. Peterson had a box of books in the back. Thought you might like it." Clara's throat tightened. It had been so long since anyone had given her a gift, longer still since anyone had given her something that acknowledged who she really was, a woman who loved poetry, who'd once spent afternoons in her father's library reading verse until the light failed. "I can't accept this," she said, even as her fingers tightened on the cover. "Sure you can. It's just a book." But his eyes said it was more than that, and they both knew it. "Thank you," Clara whispered, and when their eyes met, the air between them felt charged, heavy with possibility and danger in equal measure. Maggie watched this exchange from behind the bar, her expression unreadable. Later, as Clara was washing dishes in the back room, the older woman came in and stood beside her, arms crossed over her chest. "That cowboy's got feelings for you," Maggie said without preamble. Clara's hand stilled in the soapy water. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do. And unless I'm misreading things entirely, you've got feelings for him too." Maggie's voice was gentle, but firm. "I'm not judging, Clara. Lord knows you deserve some happiness, but I need you to be careful." "Careful of what?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. "Of hoping too much. Of letting someone in when you've spent all this time keeping people out." Maggie paused, choosing her words. "You've got secrets, girl. We all do. But secrets have a way of coming out, especially when feelings get involved. Just make sure you know what you're doing." Clara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Maggie squeezed her shoulder once, then left her alone with her thoughts and her fears. That evening, a traveler arrived in Copper Ridge, a thin man with sharp eyes and a carpet bag, asking questions. He stopped at the general store, the telegraph office, and finally the Silver Spur, where he ordered whiskey and sat in the corner, watching. Clara felt his gaze on her like a physical touch, assessing, calculating. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear into the night, but she forced herself to stay calm, to keep serving drinks, to maintain her facade. When Elias arrived for his usual evening meal, he noticed the stranger immediately. Clara watched as his posture shifted subtly, becoming more alert, his hand resting casually near his gun. He caught her eye across the room, a silent question in his gaze. She gave the smallest shake of her head, "I don't know him," and saw him relax slightly. The stranger left after an hour, tipping his hat to Maggie and disappearing into the night, but the damage was done. Clara's carefully constructed peace had been shattered, replaced by the familiar taste of fear. "You all right?" Elias asked quietly when she brought him coffee. "Fine," Clara lied, her hands trembling slightly as she set down the cup. Elias caught her wrist, that same gentle grip from before, and waited until she met his eyes. "If you're in trouble, you can tell me. I might be able to help." "I'm not in trouble." The lie felt heavy on her tongue. "Clara, please," her voice broke on the word. "Please don't ask questions I can't answer." Something painful crossed his face, but he released her wrist. "All right, but if that changes, if you need anything, you come find me. Understand?" Clara nodded and fled to the back room, where she stood with her forehead pressed against the cool wall, fighting back tears. This was why she couldn't let herself care about Elias Boone. This was why connection was dangerous, because caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risk, and risk meant losing everything she'd worked so hard to build. But God help her, she did care. Against all logic and self-preservation, she cared about the cowboy with the sad blue eyes and the kind heart. Saturday brought a town social, a monthly gathering held at the church hall where families came together for music, dancing, and community. Clara usually avoided these events, preferring to stay invisible, but Maggie insisted she needed a night off from the saloon. "You'll work yourself into an early grave," Maggie said firmly. "Go, dance. Remember what it feels like to be young." So Clara found herself at the church hall, wearing her best dress, a deep green that brought out her eyes, one of the few nice things she'd kept from her old life. She stood near the wall, watching as couples whirled across the floor to the music of a fiddle and guitar, feeling both part of the community and utterly separate from it. "You look beautiful," said a voice beside her, and Clara turned to find Elias standing there, clean-shaven for the first time since she'd met him. Without the stubble, he looked younger, more vulnerable, and achingly handsome. "You clean up well yourself," Clara replied, taking in his pressed shirt and string tie. "My mother always said a man should look his best when calling on a lady." He offered his hand, palm up, an invitation. "Would you dance with me?" Clara knew she should refuse. Dancing meant being close, meant lowering her guard, meant all the things Maggie had warned her about. But looking at Elias, at the hope and uncertainty in his eyes, she found she couldn't say no. "One dance," she said, placing her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and calloused and strong, and he led her onto the floor. The fiddler struck up a waltz, and suddenly Clara was being swept into Elias's arms, his hand at her waist, their bodies moving together in perfect rhythm. "You're a good dancer," Elias murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "My father insisted on lessons," Clara said, then froze, realizing her mistake. The widow from Denver wouldn't have had formal dance instruction. But Elias didn't press, just pulled her slightly closer, and Clara let herself sink into the moment, into the feeling of being held by someone who saw her, really saw her, and hadn't run away. They danced through one song, then another, and another, until Clara lost count. Other couples moved around them, the hall filled with laughter and music and the stamp of boots on wooden floors, but Clara was only aware of Elias, the solid strength of his chest, the gentle pressure of his hand on her back, the way he looked at her like she was something precious. "Tell me something true, Clara," he said again, that question becoming a refrain between them. Clara thought about all the truths she carried, about Richard Ashford's blood on her hands, about the life she'd fled, about the wanted posters that might still bear her real name. Instead, she said, I haven't felt this safe in a long time. It was true, she realized with a start. Here, in Elias's arms, with the music swirling around them and his eyes holding hers, she felt safer than she had in the entire year since running. It was an illusion, of course. Safety was something she'd forfeited the night she'd killed a man. But for this moment, she let herself believe in it. Good, Elias said softly. That's good, because you are safe, Clara. I swear it. It was a promise he couldn't possibly keep, but Clara's heart swelled anyway. They danced until the musicians took a break. Then Elias led her outside where the night air was cold and clean, full of pine and snow and possibility. I need to tell you something, Elias said, his hand still holding hers. And I know the timing's poor and maybe I've got no right, but I can't keep it in anymore. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Elias, let me say it, please. He took a breath, his thumbs tracing circles on the backs of her hands. From the moment I walked into that saloon, you've been all I can think about. The way you move, the way you talk, the way your eyes hold all these secrets I want to know. I know you're running from something. I know you've got a past you're not ready to share. And I know I'm probably 10 kinds of fool for saying this, but Clara Wynne, whoever you are, whatever you've done, I'm falling for you. Have been since that first cup of coffee. The words hung in the frozen air between them, beautiful and terrifying. Clara wanted to laugh, to cry, to run away and pull him closer all at once. This man, this good, damaged, honest man, was offering her something she'd thought lost forever. Acceptance, affection, maybe even love. You don't know what you're saying, Clara whispered. You don't know me. Not really. Then tell me. Tell me who you really are. His voice was urgent now, pleading. I don't care what you've done, Clara. I've done things too, things I'm not proud of. We've all got blood on our hands in one way or another, but that doesn't mean we don't deserve a second chance at happiness. Clara pulled her hands from his, wrapping her arms around herself. What if I told you I'm not who I say I am? That Clara Wynne is a lie? Then I'd ask you to tell me the truth. And if the truth is ugly, if it's dangerous, then we'll face it together. Elias stepped closer, his presence enveloping her like a shield. I was a lawman, Clara. I know how to protect people. Let me protect you. The offer was so tempting, so beautifully naive, but Clara knew that some things couldn't be protected against. Some truths were too heavy to share. If she told Elias about Richard Ashford, about the murder, he'd have a choice to make, help her hide or turn her in. And she couldn't bear to put him in that position, couldn't bear to watch him choose between his conscience and his feelings. I can't, she said, her voice breaking. I'm sorry, Elias, I can't. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the snow. And if her vision was blurred with tears, she told herself it was just the cold wind stinging her eyes. The next morning, Elias didn't come to the saloon. Clara told herself it was for the best, that distance would protect them both. But the hollow ache in her chest suggested otherwise. She moved through her duties mechanically, serving coffee and clearing tables, while Maggie watched with concerned eyes. You want to talk about it? Maggie asked finally, around mid-morning when the breakfast crowd had cleared. Nothing to talk about, Clara said, scrubbing a table with unnecessary force. That cowboy has feelings for you, real feelings. And unless I'm blind, you feel the same way. It doesn't matter, Clara's voice was flat. Some things aren't meant to be. Why not? Because you've got a past? Maggie moved closer, lowering her voice. Clara, honey, we all have pasts. That's what the frontier is for, giving people a chance to start over, to be someone new. You don't understand. Clara's hand stilled on the rag. My past isn't something I can outrun. It's not just mistakes or regrets, it's... She stopped, unable to continue without revealing too much. Maggie was quiet for a long moment. Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone. That's what I'm trying to tell you. That man out there, he's offering to help carry the weight. Don't be too proud or too scared to let him. Before Clara could respond, the door burst open and Tommy Hastings stumbled in, his face pale and his shirt torn. Miss Maggie, Clara, we need help. There's been an accident at the ranch. Pa sent me to fetch the doctor, but he's out delivering a baby. Mr. Boone's hurt bad. Clara's world tilted. What happened? Horse threw him into a fence post. He's bleeding something awful and... Tommy swallowed hard. Pa thinks he might not make it if we don't get help soon. Clara didn't remember moving, didn't remember grabbing her coat or running out the door. She was simply suddenly outside, following Tommy through the snow toward the Larson Ranch at the edge of town. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her breath coming in ragged gasps that had nothing to do with exertion. Please, she prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening. Please don't take him. Not like this. Not before I could tell him the truth. The Larson Ranch house came into view, and Clara burst through the door without knocking. Inside, she found Elias laid out on a table, his shirt soaked with blood, his face pale as death. Bill Hastings stood nearby, looking helpless, while Mrs. Larson pressed a cloth to Elias's side. Thank God, Mrs. Larson said when she saw Clara. We need someone with steady hands. This wound needs stitching, and I can't. My arthritis. I'll do it, Clara heard herself say. She'd never stitched a wound in her life, but she'd watched the family doctor treat her father's workers after accidents in the warehouse. She knew the basics. She had to try. Mrs. Larson quickly gathered supplies: needle, thread, whiskey for sterilization, and pain relief. Clara scrubbed her hands, her mind oddly calm now that she had a purpose. She approached the table where Elias lay, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. Elias, she said softly, touching his face. His skin was cold and clammy. Can you hear me? His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then locking onto her face. Clara, he whispered, you came. Of course I came, you fool. Her voice cracked. Now hold still. This is going to hurt. Bill Hastings and his son held Elias down while Clara examined the wound, a deep gash in his side where the fence post had caught him. It was bleeding heavily, but didn't seem to have hit any vital organs. If she could stop the bleeding and prevent infection, he might survive. She poured whiskey over the wound and Elias jerked, a groan tearing from his throat. Clara's hands trembled as she threaded the needle, but once she began stitching, a strange calm descended. She worked carefully, methodically, closing the wound with small, even stitches while Elias gritted his teeth against the pain. Talk to me, Elias gasped out. Distract me. Tell me something true. Clara's hands paused for just a moment. Here, with his blood on her hands and death hovering close, the lies seemed impossible. My real name is Celeste, she whispered, low enough that only he could hear. Celeste Morgan. And I'm wanted for murder. Elias's eyes, glazed with pain, somehow sharpened. Did you do it? Yes. The word came out on a sob. I killed my fiancé. He was hurting me, and I fought back, and he died. I ran, changed my name. I've been running ever since. Then you fought to live, Elias said, echoing his words from before. His hand found hers, blood and all. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing at all. Clara finished the last stitch, her vision blurred with tears. She bandaged the wound carefully, then sat back, exhausted and emotionally raw. Elias had closed his eyes again, his breathing more regular now, color slowly returning to his face. He'll need watching, Mrs. Larson said quietly. Fever might set in. Someone should stay with him. I will, Clara said immediately. I'll stay. And she did. For 3 days, Clara barely left Elias's side, sleeping in a chair beside his bed in the Larsons' guest room, changing his bandages, spooning broth into him when he was conscious enough to swallow. Maggie brought fresh clothes and covered Clara's shifts at the saloon without complaint. The Larsons provided food and space and didn't ask questions about why the saloon girl was so devoted to their new ranch hand. On the second night, Elias developed a fever. He thrashed and muttered, caught in nightmares Clara couldn't reach. She bathed his forehead with cool water, held his hand, and talked to him. About everything and nothing. About her childhood in San Francisco, about her father's shipping business, about the books she'd loved and the dreams she'd abandoned. If he heard her confessions, he gave no sign, lost in his fevered visions. But on the third morning, the fever broke. Clara woke from an uneasy doze to find Elias watching her, his eyes clear and focused. You look terrible, he said, his voice hoarse but amused. Clara laughed, the sound half sob. You're one to talk. You nearly died. But I didn't. His hand found hers again, squeezing gently. Thanks to you. Mrs. Larson says your stitching probably saved my life. I couldn't. Clara stopped, swallowing hard. I couldn't let you die. Not after. She trailed off, unable to finish. Not after you told me the truth? Elias's voice was gentle. Celeste. The sound of her real name, spoken aloud for the first time in over a year, made Clara flinch. You remember that? Every word. He struggled to sit up, wincing, and Clara helped arrange pillows behind him. You killed a man who was hurting you. Your fiancé, you said. Clara nodded, unable to meet his eyes. Richard Ashford, in San Francisco, almost 2 years ago now. Everyone thought he was perfect. Successful lawyer, good family, everything a woman could want. But he wasn't. He was cruel and controlling, and that night he tried to. She stopped, the memory still too raw. I fought back. He fell and hit his head. There was so much blood, I panicked and ran. Did you mean to kill him? No, I just wanted him to stop touching me, to see me as a person instead of property. He'd already bought. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. But that doesn't matter, does it? He's still dead. I'm still a murderer. Elias was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. I told you about Jim Carson, he said finally. About how I shot a man who maybe didn't deserve killing. You know what the difference is between you and me? You were defending yourself. I was just wrong. The law won't see it that way. A woman who kills her fiancé? They'll hang me, Elias, or lock me away forever. Either way, my life is over if they find me. Then we won't let them find you. His voice was firm, decided. You're not going back to San Francisco. You're not hanging for protecting yourself from a man who should have protected you. Clara finally looked at him, seeing the determination in his blue eyes. You can't mean that. You were a lawman. You believe in justice. I believe in justice, Elias agreed. But I also know the difference between law and justice, and they're not always the same thing. What happened to you? That wasn't justice. That was a woman fighting for her life. And I'll be damned if I let anyone punish you for surviving. The words unlocked something in Clara's chest, something that had been frozen for so long she'd forgotten it could thaw. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and Elias pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her despite the pain it must have caused his wound. It's all right, he murmured into her hair. You're all right. I've got you. And for the first time since that terrible night in San Francisco, Celeste Morgan, Clara Wynne, whatever name she wore, believed it might actually be true. The next days passed in a strange bubble of intimacy. As Elias recovered, Clara stayed close, helping him walk when he was strong enough, reading to him from his Homer when he was restless. They talked for hours, real conversations now that the pretense was gone. Clara told him about her childhood, about her mother who'd died when she was 12, about her father who'd built an empire but never quite knew how to talk to his daughter. Elias shared his own stories, about growing up poor in Texas, about joining the Rangers to make something of himself, about the disillusionment that came from seeing too much injustice dressed up as law. I thought I was one of the good guys, Elias said one afternoon, staring out the window at the snow-covered mountains. Thought I was making the world better, but sometimes I wonder if I was just another bully with a badge using the law as an excuse for violence. You stepped in when Tommy was harassing Annie, Clara reminded him, and when Jake Mercer was abusing Mary Chen, you protected people who needed protecting. That's not a bully. That's a good man. Elias turned to look at her, something vulnerable in his expression. You really believe that? I do. And she did. Whatever mistakes Elias had made, whatever blood stained his conscience, she could see the goodness in him, the core of decency that made him intervene when others looked away, that made him offer protection without asking for anything in return. On the 6th day after the accident, Elias was finally strong enough to return to his room at the boarding house. Clara walked with him, hovering anxiously as he navigated the snow-packed street. At the boarding house steps, he turned to her, catching her hand. Will you come to the town social with me this Saturday? He asked. Properly this time as my guest? Clara hesitated. Going to the social as Elias's date would make them visible as a couple, would invite questions and attention she'd spent over a year avoiding. But looking at him, at the hope in his eyes and the vulnerability in his expression, she found herself nodding. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." Elias smiled, and it was like sunrise after a long winter night. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles, and Clara felt warmth bloom in her chest, pushing back the perpetual cold of fear she'd carried for so long. Saturday arrived wrapped in fresh snow and clear skies. Clara spent extra time preparing, brushing out her auburn hair until it shone, pinning it up with the few good hairpins she'd kept from her old life. She wore the green dress again, the one that made her eyes look like summer grass, and when she studied her reflection in the small mirror, she barely recognized herself. The hunted, haunted look had faded, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. Elias called for her at the saloon just before sunset, looking handsome in his pressed shirt and vest. His face had regained its color, though he moved carefully, still healing. When he saw Clara, his expression transformed into something close to awe. "You're beautiful," he said simply, and Clara felt herself blush like a schoolgirl. They walked to the church hall together, and this time Clara didn't hover by the wall. She stayed by Elias's side as he introduced her to people he'd met at the ranch, as they shared a simple meal of stew and cornbread, as the music started and couples began to dance. "May I have this dance?" Elias asked with exaggerated formality, bowing slightly, and Clara laughed, as she accepted his hand. They moved onto the floor, and despite his healing wound, Elias led her through the waltz with confidence. Clara felt the eyes of the town on them, but for once she didn't care. Let them look. Let them see her happy. Let them see her with this good man who knew her secrets and stood by her anyway. "Tell me something true," Elias murmured as they swayed to the music. Clara thought for a moment, then said, "I'm not afraid anymore. For the first time in almost 2 years, I'm not constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up." "Good." Elias pulled her closer, his voice low and intimate. "Because you're not alone anymore, Celeste. Whatever comes, we face it together." The use of her real name, spoken softly in the midst of the crowded hall where everyone knew her as Clara, should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home, like finally being seen and known and accepted completely. They danced through one song, then another. Other couples whirled around them, the Hastings, the Larsons, young couples courting, older couples comfortable in their long partnerships. The fiddle sang and the guitar thrummed, and Clara let herself sink into the moment, into the feeling of Elias's arms around her and the possibility of a future she'd thought forever lost. But as the second song ended and they stepped outside for air, Clara saw something that made her blood freeze. Across the street, barely visible in the lamplight, stood the thin man with the carpet bag, the stranger who'd come through town asking questions. He was watching the hall, watching the door, and when he saw Clara, his eyes narrowed with recognition. "Elias," Clara breathed, gripping his arm. "That man, the one who was at the saloon asking questions, he's here." Elias followed her gaze, his posture immediately shifting into alertness. "Stay here," he said quietly. "I'll find out what he wants." "No," Clara started, but Elias was already moving across the street with deceptive casualness. She watched, her heart hammering, as the two men spoke. The conversation was brief, tense, and then the stranger was walking away quickly, disappearing into the darkness between buildings. Elias returned, his expression grim. "We need to talk. Somewhere private." They walked in silence to the Silver Spur, which was closed for the evening. Maggie had given Clara a key, and they let themselves into the dark saloon. Clara lit a lamp with trembling hands while Elias secured the door behind them. "What did he say?" Clara asked, dreading the answer. Elias took a breath. "His name is Daniel Hayes. He's a U.S. Marshal." The world tilted beneath Clara's feet. A marshal, here, looking for her. This was it, the end of everything. She'd been found, and now she would hang, and— "Clara, Celeste, listen to me." Elias gripped her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "He's not here for you. He's here for someone else, a cattle rustler operating in the territory. But he recognized your description. Someone in San Francisco is still looking for you, and there's a wanted poster making the rounds. He's seen it." "Then it's over," Clara whispered. Her legs gave out and she sank into a chair, all the hope from moments ago draining away like water through a sieve. He'll arrest me. Take me back. And I'll hang. No. Elias knelt in front of her, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. That's not going to happen, because Marshall Hayes owes me a favor, a big one. 3 years ago, I saved his life during a raid on the border. He's always said if I ever needed anything, all I had to do was ask. Clara stared at him, not daring to hope. What are you saying? I'm saying I asked him to help you, and he agreed. Elias's grip tightened on her hands. Hayes is going to go back to San Francisco and dig into your case. He'll talk to witnesses, look at evidence, find out exactly what happened that night. When he can prove it was self-defense, he'll take that evidence to a judge and get the charges dropped or reduced. Why would he do that? I'm a fugitive. Because he's a good man who understands that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing, and because I convinced him that you deserve a chance to clear your name properly, not just keep running. Clara wanted to believe it, wanted so desperately to believe that salvation might be possible, but she'd learned to be cautious, to expect the worst. And if he can't prove it was self-defense? If the Ashford family's version stands? Elias's face hardened. Then we disappear. Head to California or Oregon, change our names again, start over somewhere no one knows us. I'm not letting them take you, Celeste. I meant what I said. Whatever comes, we face it together. You'd give up everything for me? Your job, your reputation, your chance at a normal life. In a heartbeat. There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt in his eyes. I've been drifting for a year looking for something to believe in again, and then I walked into a saloon in Montana and found you. You're what I've been looking for, Celeste. You're my second chance, and I'm not losing you without a fight. The tears came then, hot and overwhelming, years of fear and loneliness and guilt pouring out. Elias pulled her into his arms, holding her while she sobbed, whispering reassurances against her hair. When the storm finally passed, Clara pulled back slightly, looking at this man who'd somehow become her anchor in the chaos. I love you, she said, the words emerging unbidden but absolutely true. I know it's too soon, and it's probably foolish, but I love you, Elias Boone. His answer was to kiss her, gently at first, then deeper, his hands cradling her face like she was something infinitely precious. Clara kissed him back, pouring all her gratitude and fear and hope into the contact, and for those moments, nothing else existed except the two of them and the promise of a future they'd fight for together. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Elias rested his forehead against hers. I love you too, he said. Loved you from that first cup of coffee, I think. Just took me a while to understand what that meant. They sat together in the dark saloon, holding each other, making plans. Hayes would leave in 2 days to begin his investigation. It might take months to gather evidence, to track down witnesses, to build a case. In the meantime, Clara would stay in Copper Ridge, continuing her life as Clara Wynne while they waited for word. Elias would work at the Larson Ranch and be close by, ready to protect her if anyone else came looking. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't safe. But it was hope. Real, tangible hope. And that was more than Clara had allowed herself to feel in almost 2 years. The weeks that followed Marshall Hayes' departure stretched like taffy, each day simultaneously too fast and achingly slow. Clara, she still thought of herself as Clara most of the time, Celeste feeling like a costume she'd put away in mothballs, moved through her routines at the Silver Spur with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. Every morning brought the possibility of news, good or bad, and every evening, settled, without word from San Francisco, felt like a small victory and a prolonged agony in equal measure. Elias had returned to work at the Larson Ranch once his wound had healed enough, though he still favored his left side and moved more carefully than before. But every evening, without fail, he appeared at the saloon for dinner, taking his table by the stove and reading his Homer while Clara worked. His presence had become as essential to her as breathing, a steady anchor in waters that had been turbulent for so long. On a particularly cold evening in late January, Clara was wiping down tables when the door opened to admit, not Elias, but Jake Mercer. The rancher who'd harassed Mary Chen stood in the doorway, his bulk blocking the lamplight from outside, his small eyes scanning the room until they landed on Clara. Something in his expression made her skin crawl. a predatory awareness that sent every instinct screaming. "Well, well," Mercer said, his voice carrying across the nearly empty saloon. "If it ain't the pretty little saloon girl. Where's your cowboy protector tonight?" Clara forced her voice to remain steady. "Mr. Mercer, what can I get you? Information, maybe?" He moved further into the room, letting the door close behind him with a heavy thud. "See, I was talking to a friend of mine who came through town a few weeks back. Thin fellow, asked a lot of questions. And he told me something interesting, said there's a woman wanted in California. Murder, he said. Young woman with green eyes and auburn hair." His smile was ugly. "Fancy that." Clara's heart stopped, but she kept her expression neutral through sheer force of will. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Mercer took another step closer, and Clara instinctively moved behind the bar, putting solid wood between them. "See, I got to thinking. What if that woman was hiding out here, pretending to be someone she ain't? What if she was working right here in this saloon, serving drinks, and acting all innocent?" "That's quite a story," Clara said, grateful that her voice didn't shake. "But I think you've been drinking too much of your own whiskey, Mr. Mercer." "Have I?" His hand moved to his gun belt, not drawing, but making the threat clear. "Or maybe I'm just smarter than you give me credit for. See, I don't like being humiliated, especially not in front of the whole town by some drifter cowboy and his whore." The slur made Clara flinch, but before she could respond, Maggie emerged from the back room, a shotgun cradled in her arms with the casual competence of someone who knew how to use it. "That's enough, Mercer," Maggie said, her voice hard as iron. "You'll apologize to Clara, finish your business elsewhere, and get out of my establishment." Mercer's eyes flicked to the shotgun, then back to Clara, calculation written across his face. "This ain't over," he said quietly. "Not by a long shot. Maybe I'll send a telegram to San Francisco, see if anyone's interested in what I know. And maybe I'll tell Sheriff Morrison about how you've been stealing cattle from your neighbors," Maggie countered. "Don't think I don't know about that, Jake. Don't think the whole town doesn't know. You want to start throwing stones, be prepared for the glass house you're living in to come crashing down." For a long moment, the three of them stood frozen in a tableau of threat and counter-threat. Then Mercer spat on the floor, a gesture of pure contempt, and stalked out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Clara's legs gave out, and she sank onto a stool behind the bar, her whole body trembling. Maggie set the shotgun down and came around to put an arm around her shoulders. "It's all right, girl. He's gone." "He knows," Clara whispered, "or suspects. Either way, he's dangerous. He's a bully and a coward," Maggie said firmly. "But you're right. He's dangerous. We need to tell Elias." As if summoned by the speaking of his name, Elias burst through the door, his face flushed from running. "I passed Mercer on the street. He was smiling like he'd won something. What happened?" Clara told him, the words tumbling out in a rush. As she spoke, she watched Elias's expression harden, his jaw clenching with barely controlled anger. "That son of a—" He stopped, visibly forcing himself to calm down. All right. We need to think this through. Mercer's not going to let this go, not after being embarrassed twice. The question is what he'll do about it." "He threatened to send a telegram to San Francisco," Clara said. "If the Ashford family finds out where I am—" "They won't have time to do anything about it," Elias interrupted. "Because if Mercer makes a move, we'll be gone before any response arrives. I've got money saved, enough to get us to Oregon or California. We can leave tonight if we need to." "And go where?" Clara asked, the despair she'd been fighting threatening to overwhelm her. "Keep running forever? What kind of life is that?" "A life together," Elias said, kneeling in front of her stool and taking her hands. "I don't care where we go or what name we use. As long as we're together, that's enough." "It's not enough for me." The words surprised Clara even as she spoke them, but once they were out, she realized their truth. "I'm tired of running, Elias. Tired of lying, tired of being afraid. If Mercer wants to expose me, let him. Maybe it's time I faced what I did instead of hiding from it." "No." Elias's voice was fierce. "You're not turning yourself in. I won't let you hang for defending yourself against a man who tried to force himself on you." "Then what do you suggest?" Clara pulled her hands away, frustration giving her voice an edge. We can't run forever. Eventually someone will recognize me, or a wanted poster will make its way here, or Marshall Hayes will come back with proof of your innocence, Elias finished. We just need to buy time until then. And if he doesn't come back? If he can't prove anything? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Maggie, who'd been watching this exchange with sharp eyes, finally spoke up. There's another option, she said slowly. One you're not going to like, but hear me out. What if we get ahead of this? What if Clara, Celeste, tells her story first before Mercer can twist it into something ugly? Tell who? Clara asked. The town, Sheriff Morrison, at least. Lay out exactly what happened, that you were attacked, that you defended yourself, that you ran because you knew a rich man's family would destroy you rather than admit their son was a predator. Maggie's voice grew passionate. People here know you, Clara. They've seen how you work, how you conduct yourself. They know you're not a cold-blooded killer. If you tell the truth first before Mercer poisons the well, they might believe you, might even protect you. Or they might string me up themselves, Clara countered. I killed a man, Maggie. That's a fact. Everything else is just my word against a dead man's reputation. Not if there's proof, Elias said suddenly, his eyes lighting with realization. Not if we can show that Richard Ashford had a pattern of behavior. There must have been other women. Men like that don't stop with one victim. If Hayes is doing his job, he's tracking down those women, getting their statements. Even if he finds them, what makes you think they'll talk? Clara's voice was bitter. I barely escaped with my life. Other women might not want to risk their reputations by admitting what happened to them. Some might, Elias insisted. Some might be brave enough, especially if they know it could prevent him from hurting anyone else, even posthumously, by clearing your name. Clara wanted to believe him, wanted to have faith that justice might actually prevail. But she'd seen too much of the world's ugliness, seen how society protected powerful men while destroying the women they victimized. Still, looking at Elias's earnest face and Maggie's determined expression, she felt something crack in the armor of cynicism she'd built. All right, she said quietly. We wait for Hayes. We don't run unless we absolutely have to. But if Mercer makes good on his threat, then we deal with it, Elias finished. Together. The next morning brought fresh snow and an unexpected visitor. Clara was sweeping the saloon floor when Sheriff Morrison walked in, his weathered face serious beneath his gray mustache. Her heart leapt into her throat, certain that Mercer had already acted, that this was the beginning of the end. Morning, Clara, Morrison said, removing his hat. Is Maggie around? Back room, Clara managed, her voice steadier than she felt. I'll get her. But Maggie had already heard the sheriff's voice and emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. Buck, what brings you by so early? Need to talk to you about Jake Mercer, Morrison said. Can we speak privately? Maggie glanced at Clara, then shook her head. Whatever you need to say, you can say in front of Clara. She's family. The sheriff's expression was unreadable as he studied Clara for a long moment. Then he sighed, moving to sit at one of the tables. All right, Jake Mercer came to see me last night, drunk and talking wild. Said he had information about a wanted fugitive hiding in Copper Ridge. Specifically, said Clara here is really someone named Celeste Morgan, wanted for murder in California. The world seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet, but she forced herself to remain standing, to meet the sheriff's eyes. What did you tell him? I told him to sleep it off and come back when he was sober, Morrison said. But the truth is, Clara, or should I say Celeste, I need to know if there's any truth to what he's saying. This was it. The moment Clara had been dreading for nearly 2 years. She could lie, could maintain her fiction, but looking at Sheriff Morrison's weathered, honest face, she found she couldn't. She was so tired of lying. It's true, she said quietly, and felt Maggie stiffen beside her. My real name is Celeste Morgan. I'm wanted in San Francisco for killing my fiancé, Richard Ashford. It happened almost 2 years ago. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his face betraying no emotion. You want to tell me what happened? So Clara did. The whole story spilled out, her engagement to Richard, the facade of perfection that hid his true nature, the night he'd attacked her, the terrible accident that had ended his life. She told Morrison about running, about the 1.5 years she'd spent looking over her shoulder, about building a new life in Copper Ridge, and finally, she told him about Marshall Hayes and his promise to investigate, to find proof of her innocence. When she finished, the saloon was silent, except for the crackling of the fire in the stove. Morrison sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "That's quite a story," he said finally. "It's the truth," Clara replied. "I swear it." "I believe you." The words were so unexpected that Clara almost didn't process them. "I've been a lawman for 30 years, and I've gotten pretty good at reading people. You're not a killer, Clara. Celeste. You're a woman who fought for her life and has been paying the price ever since." "So what happens now?" Maggie asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "You going to arrest her?" Morrison rubbed his face tiredly. "Technically, I should. There's a warrant out and I'm sworn to uphold the law. But here's the thing. I've also got discretion about when and how I enforce warrants, especially ones from outside my jurisdiction. And it seems to me that this situation isn't as cut and dried as it might appear." Meaning, Clara hardly dared to hope. "Meaning I'm inclined to wait and see what this Marshall Hayes turns up before I make any decisions." Morrison stood, settling his hat back on his head. "In the meantime, you keep your head down, stay out of trouble, and for God's sake, stay away from Jake Mercer. That man's got a mean streak and a grudge, which is a dangerous combination." "Thank you," Claire whispered, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Sheriff." "Don't thank me yet. If Hayes doesn't come through, I may not have a choice in what happens next. The law's the law, even when it's unjust." He moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry for what happened to you. No woman should have to fight off a man who's supposed to protect her." After Morrison left, Clara sank into a chair, her entire body shaking with reaction. Maggie sat beside her, pulling her into a fierce hug. "See," Maggie said. "I told you, people here know you. They're not going to let you hang without a fight." But Clara's relief was tempered by reality. Morrison might be sympathetic, but he was also a lawman with responsibilities. If push came to shove, he would do his duty. Their safety, her safety, still hung by a thread, dependent on a marshal she barely knew and evidence that might not exist. That evening, when Elias arrived at the saloon, Clara told him about Morrison's visit. She watched Relief War with concern on his face as he processed the news. "So we've got the sheriff on our side, at least tentatively," Elias said. "That's something, but Mercer's still a problem." "He's more than a problem," Clara replied. "He's got information that could destroy me, and he knows it. The question is what he wants in exchange for his silence." The answer came 2 days later, delivered by a nervous-looking ranch hand who worked for Mercer. The man handed Clara a sealed envelope at the saloon, wouldn't meet her eyes, and left quickly without waiting for a response. Inside was a letter, written in crude but clear handwriting. Clara read it once, then again, her blood running cold. "What is it?" Maggie asked, seeing Clara's expression. Wordlessly, Clara handed her the letter. Maggie read aloud, her voice hardening with each word. "You got something I want. I got information you don't want spread around. Meet me at the old Henderson place tomorrow at noon. Come alone or I start talking. J.M." "Absolutely not," Elias said when Clara showed him the letter an hour later. "You're not meeting that man alone. It's obviously a trap." "Of course it's a trap," Clara agreed. "But what choice do I have? If I don't go, he'll tell everyone what he knows. Even if Morrison believes my story, others might not. At best, I'll be run out of town. At worst, you'll hang," Elias finished grimly. "Which is exactly what will happen if you meet Mercer alone. You think he just wants to talk? Men like that, they want power, control. He'll either try to blackmail you into something worse or—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Clara understood what he wasn't saying. Mercer might decide that a dead woman couldn't testify against him, and a murdered fugitive would be easy to explain away. "So we turn it around," Clara said slowly, an idea forming. "We spring the trap on him instead. I go to the meeting, but you're there too, hidden. If Mercer tries anything, then I stop him," Elias finished, his eyes gleaming with dangerous intent. "It's risky, but it might work. Better than letting him control the situation." "Or we could tell Sheriff Morrison," Maggie interjected. "Let the law handle this." "And say what?" Clara asked. "That Mercer sent me a threatening letter? He could claim it's about anything, a business dispute, a misunderstanding. Without proof of what he's really threatening, Morrison can't do anything. She's right, Elias said reluctantly. Mercer's been smart about this. He hasn't actually broken any laws that we can prove. It's just his word against ours about what he knows and what he's threatening. They spent the rest of the evening planning, working out every detail of how the confrontation might go and how to prepare for various contingencies. Elias would arrive at the old Henderson place, an abandoned homestead a few miles outside of town, well before noon, and position himself where he could see and hear everything but remain hidden. Clara would ride out alone, as instructed, and try to get Mercer to reveal his true intentions. If things went wrong, Elias would intervene. It wasn't a perfect plan. It had a dozen ways it could go wrong and get them both killed, but it was the best option they had. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed above the general store, staring at the ceiling and thinking about all the choices that had led her to this moment. If she'd refused Richard's marriage proposal, if she'd told someone about his true nature, if she'd fought harder or run faster or simply accepted what he tried to do, any of these choices might have changed everything, but she hadn't known then what she knew now, that fighting for yourself, even when it costs everything, is better than the slow death of submission. Just before dawn, there was a soft knock at her door. Clara opened it to find Elias standing in the hallway, his face drawn with worry. "Couldn't sleep either," he said quietly. "Can I come in?" Clara nodded, stepping back to let him enter her tiny room. Elias closed the door gently behind him and just stood there for a moment, drinking in the sight of her as if memorizing every detail. "If something goes wrong tomorrow," he started, but Clara pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't talk about what might happen. Just be here. Now." Elias caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm, then her wrist, then pulling her into his arms. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the pre-dawn darkness, taking comfort in simple proximity. Eventually they moved to sit on the edge of Clara's narrow bed, still holding each other, and Elias began to speak softly. "When I left Texas, I thought I was running from my mistakes," he said. "Thought if I could just get far enough away, I could forget what I'd done, who I'd been. But distance doesn't work that way. You carry your past with you wherever you go, and it doesn't get lighter with miles. If anything, it gets heavier because you're carrying it alone." Clara understood that truth intimately. "When did it change?" "The moment I saw you." His arms tightened around her. "I walked into that saloon looking for coffee and warmth, and instead I found someone who understood. Someone who was carrying the same kind of weight I was. And suddenly I wasn't alone anymore, and neither were you, and the weight became bearable because we could share it." "I love you," Clara said, tilting her head up to look at him. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know that. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever, the ability to hope." Elias kissed her then, deep and desperate and full of all the words they didn't have time to say. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, the first light of dawn was creeping through the window. "I should go," Elias said reluctantly. "Need to get to the Henderson place early, find a good position." "Be careful," Clara said, though the words felt inadequate. "If Mercer suspects anything, he won't." Elias cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. "I've tracked outlaws through territory twice as dangerous as Jake Mercer. He's not going to see me coming." After Elias left, Clara dressed carefully in her most practical clothes, a simple brown dress and sturdy boots, her hair braided and pinned securely. She tucked a small knife into her boot, the same one she'd carried since San Francisco, and checked to make sure the Derringer Maggie had insisted she borrow was loaded and secure in her coat pocket. She wasn't going to be helpless, no matter what Mercer had planned. The morning crawled by with agonizing slowness. Clara went through the motions at the saloon, serving breakfast to customers, wiping tables, all while the clock on the wall ticked inexorably toward noon. Maggie kept shooting her worried glances, but didn't try to talk her out of going. They both knew there was no other choice. At 11:30, Clara borrowed Maggie's horse, a steady mare named Bess, and rode out of Copper Ridge toward the Henderson place. The day was overcast, the sky heavy with the promise of snow, and the cold bit through Clara's coat despite the layers she wore. The landscape was stark and beautiful, all white snow and dark pine and jagged mountains in the distance, and Clara found herself thinking that if these were her last moments of freedom, or life, at least they were spent in this wild, honest place. The Henderson homestead came into view just before noon, a cluster of sagging buildings slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. The main house still had most of its roof, but the barn had partially collapsed and the corral fences were broken and scattered. It was a monument to failed dreams, to people who tried to carve out a life in this harsh land and been defeated by it. Clara dismounted, tying Bess to what remained of a hitching post, and scanned the area for any sign of either Mercer or Elias. She saw neither, which meant Elias had found a good hiding spot. That knowledge gave her courage as she walked toward the house, her boots crunching in the snow. "Took you long enough," came a voice from inside the house, and Clara's hand instinctively moved toward the derringer in her pocket. But she forced herself to stay calm, to play the role of frightened but cooperative victim. For now. She stepped through the broken doorway into what had once been the Hendersons' main room. Jake Mercer stood near the empty fireplace, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a gun belt strapped to his hip. His small eyes were red-rimmed and mean, his smile uglier than ever. "Mr. Mercer," Clara said, keeping her voice level, "I'm here, as you asked. What do you want?" "What do I want?" Mercer laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "I want a lot of things, Miss Morgan, or should I say, Miss Fugitive. I want respect. I want people to stop treating me like I'm nothing, and I want you to understand that I hold all the cards now. If you're looking for money, I don't have much, but—" "I don't want your money," Mercer interrupted, taking a swig from his bottle. "I want you to understand your position here. You're a murderer hiding in my town, pretending to be something you're not. That cowboy of yours thinks he can humiliate me, protect you, play the hero. But he's not here now, is he? It's just you and me, Celeste Morgan, and I'm the only thing standing between you and a rope." Clara's heart was pounding, but she kept her expression neutral. "What do you want, Mercer? Name your price." "My price?" He moved closer, and Clara smelled the whiskey on his breath, saw the dangerous glint in his eyes. "Here's my price. You come work for me. My place, my terms. You do what I say when I say it, no questions asked. Maybe I find you. Other uses, too. Pretty thing like you, wasted on a saloon floor." The implication made Clara's skin crawl, but she'd expected something like this. Men like Mercer always wanted to possess, to control, to break. "And if I refuse?" "Then I send a telegram to San Francisco tonight. Tell the Ashford family exactly where their son's killer is hiding. They're rich, powerful. They'll have lawmen here within a week. And Sheriff Morrison won't be able to protect you, no matter how much he might want to." Mercer's smile widened. "So what's it going to be? You going to be smart and cooperative, or you going to throw away your life out of pride?" Clara looked at this man, this bully, this predator, and felt a cold clarity settle over her. She'd spent almost 2 years running from Richard Ashford's ghost, letting fear dictate her choices, allowing herself to be victimized over and over by what he'd tried to do to her. But she wasn't that terrified girl anymore. She'd survived, built a new life, found love and friendship and purpose. And she was done letting men like Richard, men like Mercer, have power over her. "No," she said clearly. Mercer's expression darkened. "What did you say?" "I said no." Clara's hand moved to her pocket, closing around the derringer. "I'm not working for you. I'm not giving you power over me. And if you send that telegram, then I'll deal with the consequences. But I'm done being afraid of men like you." For a moment, Mercer just stared at her, as if he couldn't quite process her refusal. Then his face contorted with rage, and his hand dropped to his gun. "You stupid bitch," he snarled. "I was trying to be nice, give you a choice. But if you'd rather hang—" He never finished the sentence. Clara pulled the derringer from her pocket, her hand steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system, and Mercer froze. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't draw that gun, Mercer. I've killed one man already. I don't want to kill another, but I will if you force me to." "You don't have the guts," Mercer said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now, his hand hovering over his holster. "Try me." They stood frozen in a tableau of mutual threat, the air between them electric with tension. Then a floorboard creaked behind Mercer, and Elias stepped out of the shadows where he'd been hiding, his Colt Peacemaker trained on the back of Mercer's head. "I'd listen to the lady if I were you," Elias said, his voice dangerously calm. "She's already proven she can pull a trigger when necessary. And if she doesn't shoot you, I will. Your choice." Mercer's face went pale, his eyes darting between Clara and the gun she held, calculating odds that had suddenly turned against him. Slowly, carefully, he raised his hands away from his gun belt. "That's smart," Elias said. "Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to unbuckle that gun belt very slowly with your left hand and let it drop to the floor. Then you're going to turn around and walk out of here, and you're going to forget you ever heard the name Celeste Morgan." "Or what?" Mercer's voice was sullen, but still defiant. "You're going to shoot me in cold blood. You ain't got it in you, Boone. You're too much of a Boy Scout." "You're right," Elias agreed. "I won't shoot you in cold blood, but I will testify about everything I just heard. Your attempt to blackmail Clara, your threats, your plans to send false information to San Francisco. Sheriff Morrison will be very interested in that testimony. So will the territorial judge." "False information?" Mercer laughed bitterly. "She is Celeste Morgan. She is wanted for murder. That ain't false." "But you tried to use that information for extortion and coercion," Clara said, finding her voice again. "That's illegal, Mercer. And unlike my case, which is complicated and happened in another jurisdiction, your crimes happened here, today, with a witness. Who do you think the law will come after first?" She watched the realization dawn on Mercer's face. He'd been so focused on having power over her that he'd walked right into a trap of his own making. His shoulders slumped in defeat, and he unbuckled his gun belt with clumsy fingers, letting it fall to the dusty floor. "This isn't over," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice anymore. "Yes," Elias said quietly, "it is. You're going to leave town, Mercer. Going to take your cattle and your grudges and find somewhere else to spread your poison. Because if you stay, if you even think about causing trouble for Clara or anyone else, I'll make sure every lawman in the territory knows what kind of man you are. Understood?" Mercer nodded once, jerkily, then turned and stumbled toward the door. Clara and Elias watched him go, neither lowering their guns until they heard hoofbeats fading into the distance. Only then did Clara's hand begin to shake, the adrenaline that had kept her steady finally releasing its grip. The Derringer clattered to the floor, and she found herself on her knees, great gasping sobs tearing from her throat. Elias was beside her instantly, pulling her into his arms, holding her while she shook apart and slowly pieced herself back together. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair. "You're safe. He's gone. I've got you." Eventually the storm passed, leaving Clara exhausted but somehow lighter, as if confronting Mercer had finally purged some of the poison Richard Ashford's assault had left in her soul. She pulled back, looking at Elias through tear-blurred eyes. "I told him no," she said, wonder in her voice. "I looked at him and told him no. And I meant it. I heard." Elias cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "You were magnificent. Terrifying, but magnificent." They rode back to Copper Ridge together, leading Maggie's horse between them, and Clara felt something fundamental shift inside her. She'd faced her fear and survived. She'd stood up to a bully and won. She wasn't helpless anymore, wasn't just a victim running from her past. She was someone who fought back, who chose courage over safety, who refused to let others define her worth. Whatever happened next, whether Hayes returned with proof of her innocence or she had to keep running, Clara knew she would face it differently now. Not as a frightened girl trying to hide, but as a woman who'd learned her own strength. The question was whether that strength would be enough for what was coming. The answer arrived on a bitter February morning when the wind howled down from the mountains like a living thing, and the thermometer outside Peterson's general store registered 10 below zero. Clara was restocking shelves at the Silver Spur when she heard the sound of a horse approaching at speed, unusual enough in this weather to draw her attention. Through the frosted window, she watched a rider dismount and tie his horse with quick, efficient movements that spoke of urgency. The door burst open, and Marshal Daniel Hayes stepped inside, snow crusting his beard and exhaustion etched into every line of his weathered face. He looked around the nearly empty saloon until his eyes found Clara, and something in his expression made her heart leap into her throat. "Mrs. Wynne," he said formally, though his eyes held a warmth that belied the professional tone. "I need to speak with you. Privately, if possible." Maggie appeared from the back room, took one look at Hayes's face, and nodded toward her office. "Use my space. Clara, go on. I'll handle things out here." Clara's hands trembled as she led Hayes into the small office, her mind racing through 1,000 possibilities. He'd come back, which meant he had news, but whether that news would save her or condemn her remained unclear. She gestured for him to sit, but remained standing herself, too agitated to settle. Hayes pulled a leather portfolio from inside his coat and set it on Maggie's desk with a heavy thunk. "I'm going to be direct with you, Miss Morgan, because that's the kind of man I am, and because I think you deserve the truth without pretty wrapping." The use of her real name after so long struck Clara like a physical blow, but she forced herself to nod. "Please." "I spent the last 6 weeks in San Francisco digging into your case. Talked to everyone who knew you, everyone who knew Richard Ashford, went through police reports and witness statements and every piece of evidence the authorities collected." Hayes paused, his expression grave. The picture that emerged wasn't pretty. Clara's knees buckled and she sank into the chair opposite him. "Tell me." "Richard Ashford was exactly what you said he was. A predator who hid behind wealth and respectability. I found 3 other women he'd assaulted or attempted to assault over the course of 5 years. 2 were servants in his family's household who were quietly dismissed and paid off when they tried to complain. The 3rd was a young woman from another prominent family who was convinced by her parents to stay silent rather than cause a scandal." Hope flickered in Clara's chest, fragile as candlelight in a storm. "Did they agree to testify?" "2 of them did. The 3rd is too afraid. Her family threatened to disown her if she speaks publicly." Hayes opened the portfolio and pulled out several documents. "I also found the doctor who examined you the next morning after you went to his office claiming you'd fallen. He kept detailed notes about the bruises on your arms, your torn dress, the marks on your neck. He suspected assault, but you refused to file a report." Clara's hand went unconsciously to her throat, remembering the purple fingerprints Richard's grip had left, the way they'd taken weeks to fade. "I was too ashamed, too scared of what people would say." That's what he figured. "Good man, Dr. Chen. He's willing to testify about what he saw and what he suspected." Hayes pulled out more papers, his expression softening slightly. "I also tracked down the maid who was working at the Ashford estate that night. She heard the struggle, heard you telling him to stop, heard the sound of the fight. She was too terrified to come forward at the time. The Ashfords are powerful people, but she's willing to speak now." "Why?" Clara whispered. "Why would these people risk so much to help me?" "Because truth matters. Because justice matters, even when it's delayed." Hayes leaned forward, his voice intense. "And because when I started asking questions, other stories surfaced. Turns out Richard Ashford had a reputation in certain circles. A reputation his family spent a lot of money keeping quiet. But money can only buy so much silence, especially when people learn that staying silent helped a predator operate with impunity." Clara felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but made no move to wipe them away. "What does this mean? Legally? It means I took everything I found to Judge Harrison, honest man, not in the Ashford's pocket, and presented the evidence. He agreed to review the case with fresh eyes." Hayes pulled out one final document, and Clara saw it was an official court order bearing multiple seals and signatures. "After reviewing the evidence, the judges ruled that you acted in self-defense. The murder warrant has been vacated. You're free, Miss Morgan, completely and legally free." The words didn't seem real. Clara stared at the document, at her name written in formal script, at the judge's signature declaring her innocent of murder. Free. After almost 2 years of running, of hiding, of carrying the weight of Richard's death like chains, she was free. "I don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "The Ashfords, they're powerful. You said so yourself. Why would they let this happen?" Hayes's expression turned grim. "They didn't have much choice once the evidence became public. And between you and me, I think some members of that family were relieved to have the truth come out. Richard's father died last year, and his mother has been in poor health. His sister Martha, she was always uncomfortable with how the family handled things. Once she saw the evidence, she actually helped me track down other witnesses. I think she knew, or at least suspected, what her brother really was. So it's really over? Clara could barely process the magnitude of what Hayes was saying. I can go home? Use my real name? I'm not looking over my shoulder anymore? It's over. Hayes smiled, genuine warmth in his expression. You can go wherever you want, be whoever you want. The law has no claim on you. The sob that tore from Clara's throat was equal parts grief and relief. She doubled over in the chair, her whole body shaking with the force of emotion she'd held back for so long. Hayes stood and moved to the door, calling for Maggie, and then Clara was being held by the older woman while she cried years of fear and shame and guilt into Maggie's shoulder. When the storm finally passed, Clara looked up to find both Maggie and Hayes watching her with understanding in their eyes. I need to find Elias, she said. I need to tell him. He's at the Larson Ranch, Maggie said. But honey, you're in no condition to ride out there in this weather. Send word. Have him come here. But Clara was already standing, already reaching for her coat. She'd spent almost 2 years being careful, being cautious, letting fear dictate her actions. Not anymore. Not when she had news that would change everything. The ride to the Larson Ranch was brutal. The wind cut through Clara's coat like knives, and the snow had started falling again, thick and heavy, limiting visibility to just a few feet. But Clara pushed forward, driven by a need to share this moment with the man who'd stood by her when she had nothing to offer but secrets and danger. She found Elias in the barn, mucking out stalls with single-minded focus that spoke of a man trying to work off nervous energy. He looked up when Clara stumbled through the door, his eyes widening in alarm at her snow-covered state. Clara, what are you doing out in this weather? He dropped his pitchfork and rushed to her side, brushing snow from her shoulders. Is something wrong? Did something happen? Hayes came back, Clara said, and watched Elias freeze. He found evidence, witnesses, proof that Richard attacked me, that I was defending myself. Elias's hand stilled on her shoulders. What are you saying? I'm saying the warrant's been vacated, the charges dropped. I'm free, Elias. I'm not wanted anymore. I'm not running anymore. I'm free. For a moment, Elias just stared at her, as if he couldn't quite process what she was saying. Then he let out a whoop of joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around despite the limited space and his still healing side. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. You're free, he repeated, as if testing the words. Celeste, you're really free. I am. Clara cupped his face in her cold hands. And I have you to thank for it. If you hadn't convinced Hayes to help, if you hadn't stood by me, believed in me, you would have found another way, Elias interrupted. You're the strongest person I know, Celeste Morgan. You didn't need me to save you. You saved yourself. Maybe, Clara allowed, but I didn't have to do it alone, and that made all the difference. They stood in the barn, holding each other while the storm raged outside, and Clara marveled at how much had changed in just a few months. She'd arrived in Copper Ridge as Clara Wynne, a woman running from her past with nothing but lies and fear to sustain her. Now she was leaving as Celeste Morgan, a woman who'd faced her demons and won, who'd found love and friendship and the courage to stand up for herself. But even as relief flooded through her, Clara felt a whisper of uncertainty. She was free to go anywhere now, to reclaim her old life if she wanted. She could return to San Francisco, to her father, and the house on Nob Hill, and the society she'd once belonged to. The question was, did she want to? As if reading her thoughts, Elias pulled back slightly, his expression turning serious. What happens now, with you being free and all? I don't know, Clara admitted. I hadn't let myself think that far ahead. I was so focused on just surviving day to day. Your father's in San Francisco. You could go back, reconnect with him, reclaim your inheritance, your place in society. Elias's voice was carefully neutral, but Clara could hear the fear beneath it, fear that freedom might mean losing her. I could, Clara agreed slowly. Or I could stay here, build a life in Copper Ridge, where people know me and accept me. As Clara or as Celeste? It was a good question. Clara had been living as Clara Wynne for so long that the name felt as real as the one she'd been born with. But Celeste Morgan was her true identity, her history, her heritage. Could she reclaim one without losing the other? I don't know, she said again. Maybe as both? Celeste Clara Morgan Wynne has a nice ring to it. Elias smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. You should go see your father. He's been grieving a daughter he thought was dead or worse. He deserves to know you're all right. You're trying to push me away, Clara said, understanding dawning. You think now that I'm free, I'll realize I don't need you anymore. Don't you? The vulnerability in Elias's voice made Clara's heart ache. You're a wealthy woman from San Francisco high society. I'm a broke ex-ranger working on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. We made sense when you were running, when you needed protection. But now I choose you, Clara interrupted fiercely. Not because I need you, but because I love you, because you saw me at my worst and didn't run, because you believed in my innocence when you had no reason to, because you make me laugh and challenge me to be brave and hold me when the nightmares come. That doesn't change just because the law says I'm free. You deserve more than a life in Montana territory, Elias insisted. You deserve balls and opera and society, all the things you gave up. I gave those things up the moment I hit Richard Ashford with that candlestick, Clara said bluntly. And you know what? I don't miss them. Not the way I thought I would. Yes, I miss my father. Yes, I'd like to reconcile with him. But the life I had before, the expectations, the suffocating rules, the constant performance, I don't want that back. What do you want? Clara looked at this man who'd become her anchor, her safe harbor, her home. I want mornings at the Silver Spur with you reading Homer by the stove. I want to build something real here, where people are judged by their character instead of their pedigree. I want to wake up every day knowing I chose this life instead of having it chosen for me. And most of all, I want you, if you'll have me. Elias crushed her against his chest, his voice rough with emotion. If I'll have you. Celeste, I've been yours since that first cup of coffee. I just didn't think I had the right to ask you to stay. You don't have to ask. I'm staying. Clara pulled back enough to look him in the eye. But I do need to go to San Francisco, at least for a visit. I need to see my father to explain everything that happened, and I need to face that city one more time, as a free woman instead of a fugitive. Will you come with me? To San Francisco? Elias looked startled. I'm not exactly high society material, Celeste. Neither am I, not anymore. But I need you there. Need you to help me face my past so I can fully embrace my future. Clara took his hands, her voice turning pleading. Please, Elias, come with me. Meet my father. See where I came from. And then we can decide together where we're going. Elias was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with doubt and insecurity. Then he nodded slowly. All right. If it's important to you, I'll go. But I'm telling you now, I don't own a suit, I don't know which fork to use at fancy dinners, and I'm probably going to embarrass you. You could never embarrass me, Clara said firmly. You're the most honorable man I know. Anyone who can't see that isn't worth impressing. They spent the rest of the afternoon making plans. They'd leave for San Francisco in a week, giving Clara time to prepare for the journey and to help Maggie find someone to cover her shifts at the saloon. Marshall Hayes had already provided documentation clearing Clara's name, which would make travel easier and safer. For the first time in almost 2 years, she could move freely without fear of arrest. That evening, back at the Silver Spur, Clara found herself surrounded by an impromptu celebration. Maggie had spread the word about Clara's exoneration, and half the town seemed to have turned out to congratulate her. Even Sheriff Morrison stopped by, tipping his hat and saying he'd known all along she was innocent. Clara accepted their well wishes with grace, but she was acutely aware of the absences. Jake Mercer was nowhere to be seen, having apparently taken Elias's advice and left town. And there were a few townspeople who didn't come, who still viewed her with suspicion despite the judge's ruling. But more people came than stayed away, and that felt like a victory in itself. "Speech!" someone called out, and soon the whole room was chanting for Clara to say something. She climbed onto a chair, feeling ridiculous and touched in equal measure, and looked out at the faces of people who'd become her community. "I don't know what to say," she began, then smiled. "Except thank you. When I came to Copper Ridge, I was running from my past and didn't know if I'd ever stop. You gave me a place to rest, a chance to rebuild, and friendship when I desperately needed it. You didn't ask questions you knew I couldn't answer, and you accepted me anyway. That's a gift I'll never forget. Where will you go now? Someone asked. Back to California? For a visit, Claire confirmed. I have family there I need to reconnect with, but Copper Ridge is my home now. This is where I found myself again, and this is where I'm staying. The cheer that went up made Clara's eyes sting with tears. These people, rough miners and hardscrabble ranchers, saloon girls and shopkeepers, had become her family in a way San Francisco society never had. They'd seen her at her lowest and helped lift her up. They'd protected her secret and celebrated her freedom. They were proof that home wasn't about where you came from, but about where you chose to belong. As the celebration wound down and people began filtering out into the cold night, Elias found Clara behind the bar, washing glasses with mechanical precision. You all right? He asked, taking the glass from her hands and setting it aside. I think so, Clara said. It's just, everything's happening so fast. This morning I was still a fugitive, still looking over my shoulder. Tonight I'm free, planning a trip to San Francisco, thinking about a future I'd given up hoping for. It doesn't feel quite real yet. It's real, Elias assured her. And it's going to stay real. No one's taking this away from you, Celeste. You've earned your freedom. Have I? The question emerged before Clara could stop it. Sometimes I wonder if I really deserve this. Richard is still dead. I still killed him, even if it was in self-defense. His family is still grieving, still dealing with the scandal of what he did. How can I just walk away from that and be happy? Elias took her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. Because you fought for your life and won. Because you've spent almost 2 years paying for a crime that wasn't really a crime. Because everyone deserves a second chance at happiness, including you. Richard made his choices, and those choices led to his death. That's not on you, Celeste. That's on him. I want to believe that. Then believe it. And if you can't believe it yet, trust me to believe it for you until you can. Elias pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. You're a good person who did what she had to do to survive. That's all. No more guilt, no more shame, just life, moving forward, getting better. Clara nodded, letting his words settle into her heart. It would take time to fully accept her innocence, to stop carrying the weight of Richard's death, but she was starting to believe it might be possible. The week before their departure passed in a blur of preparation. Clara wrote a letter to her father, the first communication they'd had in almost 2 years, explaining everything that had happened and telling him she was coming home for a visit. She didn't know if he'd forgive her for disappearing, for letting him think she might be dead, but she owed him the truth. She also spent hours with Maggie, going over saloon operations and training the new girl Maggie had hired to cover Clara's absence. The older woman tried to refuse Clara's help, insisting she'd managed before Clara arrived and would manage again, but Clara could see the emotion in her eyes every time their conversations turned to goodbyes. You're coming back, though, Maggie said on Clara's last night in Copper Ridge before the journey. It wasn't quite a question. I am, Clara confirmed. This is home now, Maggie. Your family. I'm not walking away from that. Even if your father wants you to stay, even if San Francisco offers you everything you gave up, even then. Clara hugged the older woman fiercely. You gave me a job when I had nothing. You trusted me when you had no reason to. You taught me that family isn't just blood. It's the people who stand by you when everything else falls apart. I'm not losing that. Maggie returned the embrace, her voice rough. You're a good girl, Clara. Celeste, whoever you are. You're a good girl, and I'm proud of you. The journey to San Francisco took 2 weeks, first by wagon to Helena, then by train through the Rockies and down the coast. Clara had forgotten how beautiful the route was. How the mountains gave way to valleys, gave way to the endless blue of the Pacific. She'd forgotten, too, what it was like to travel as herself, without constantly checking over her shoulder or changing her appearance or lying about her destination. Elias was quiet for much of the journey, clearly uncomfortable with the train's crowds and the increasingly urban landscape as they approached the city. Clara held his hand through it all, pointing out landmarks as they appeared, telling stories about her childhood that helped bridge the gap between who she'd been and who she'd become. When the train finally pulled into the San Francisco depot on a gray March afternoon, Clara's heart was hammering so hard she thought Elias must be able to hear it. Somewhere in this city was her father, probably at his office or at home, unaware that his daughter was about to walk back into his life. Ready? Elias asked as they gathered their bags. No, Claire admitted. But let's go anyway. They took a cab to Nob Hill, to the house Clara had grown up in. A beautiful Victorian mansion with gingerbread trim and a view of the bay. It looked exactly as she remembered, down to the roses her mother had planted 20 years ago still climbing the front wall. Clara stood on the sidewalk, staring up at windows that had once been as familiar as her own face, and tried to gather her courage. "He might not want to see me," she said quietly. "I hurt him, disappearing like that, letting him think I was dead, or worse. Only one way to find out." Elias squeezed her hand, then released it. "You want me to wait here, or come with you?" "Come with me. Please." Clara couldn't imagine facing this without him. They climbed the steps together, and Clara rang the bell, her own house, and she had to ring the bell like a stranger. The door was answered by a maid Clara didn't recognize, young and efficient, who looked at them with polite inquiry. "May I help you?" "I'm here to see Thomas Morgan," Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm his daughter." The maid's eyes widened in shock. "Miss Morgan? But I thought—" "We were told. I know what you were told. But I'm alive, and I'm here, and I need to see my father. Is he home?" The maid nodded mutely and stepped back to let them in. The entry hall was exactly as Clara remembered. The Persian rug, the grandfather clock, the portrait of her mother on the wall. She touched the frame gently as she passed, whispering a silent greeting to the woman who'd died too young to see how complicated her daughter's life would become. "Wait here," the maid said, then scurried up the stairs toward her father's study. Clara could hear muffled voices, a sharp exclamation, then footsteps, running footsteps, coming back down. Thomas Morgan appeared at the top of the stairs, and Clara's breath caught. He'd aged in the 2 years since she'd seen him. His hair was completely gray now, his face more lined, his shoulders slightly stooped, but his eyes held the same intelligence and warmth she remembered, and when they landed on her, they filled with tears. "Celeste," he whispered. "My God, Celeste." Then he was rushing down the stairs and Clara was running to meet him, and they collided in the middle of the entry hall in an embrace that felt like coming home and saying goodbye and being reborn all at once. "I'm sorry," Clara sobbed into her father's shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Papa. I should have come to you, should have trusted you, but I was so scared." "Hush," Thomas said, holding her tighter. "You're here now. You're alive. That's all that matters. Nothing else matters." They stood like that for a long time, father and daughter reunited after years of fear and separation. Eventually Thomas pulled back, wiping his eyes unselfconsciously, and seemed to notice Elias for the first time, standing awkwardly near the door with his hat in his hands. "And who's this?" Thomas asked, his voice still thick with emotion. "Papa, this is Elias Boone. He's—" Clara paused, trying to find words adequate to describe what Elias meant to her. "He's the man who stood by me when I had nothing. The man who helped clear my name. The man I love." Thomas studied Elias with the sharp assessment of a successful businessman, taking in the worn clothes and weathered hands, the gun belt, and the rough edges. Then he stepped forward and offered his hand. "Mr. Boone, any man who brought my daughter home to me is welcome in this house." Elias shook his hand, his relief visible. "Thank you, sir. And for what it's worth, your daughter didn't need much bringing. She's about the strongest person I've ever met." "That she is," Thomas agreed, looking at Clara with undisguised pride. "She gets that from her mother. Come, both of you. We have much to discuss, and you must be exhausted from your journey. Mrs. Chen," he called, and an older Chinese woman appeared from the back of the house. "Prepare the guest rooms. My daughter has come home." The days that followed were a strange blend of homecoming and revelation. Clara told her father everything, about Richard's assault, about running, about the life she'd built in Montana, about Elias and Maggie, and the community that had accepted her. Thomas listened to it all without interruption, his expression cycling through horror and anger and grief and finally acceptance. "I failed you," he said when she'd finished. "I should have seen what Richard really was, should have protected you from him." "You couldn't have known," Clara said gently. "He fooled everyone. That was his talent. Still, if I'd been more attentive, less focused on business—" Thomas shook his head. "I'm just grateful you survived. Grateful you found people who cared for you when I couldn't. But Thomas's acceptance came with an unspoken expectation that became clear as the visit progressed. He showed Clara through her old room, unchanged since she'd left it, and talked about reclaiming her place in society. He introduced her to business associates as his daughter returned from an extended trip, glossing over the details of where she'd been. He spoke of the future, of her inheritance, of the role she could play in Morgan and Sons. Never once did he mention Montana or Elias. It came to a head on their 5th night in San Francisco. Thomas had arranged a small dinner party, just family friends, he'd said, but Clara arrived downstairs to find the drawing room full of the same society people she'd fled from. They greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and carefully concealed judgment, asking polite questions about her absence, while their eyes said they knew about Richard, about the scandal, about her fall from grace. Clara endured it with practiced grace, but when she finally escaped to the garden for air, she found her father waiting for her. "You handled that well," Thomas said. "Better than I expected." "I've gotten good at playing roles," Clara replied, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "Montana taught me that." "About Montana." Thomas hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Celeste, I know you've built a life there, made connections, but surely you can see that your future is here. You're a Morgan. This is your heritage, your birthright." "My birthright?" Clara turned to face him. "Papa, this city tried to destroy me. These people—" She gestured toward the house, toward the party still in progress. "They believed the worst of me without question. They called me a murderer, a gold digger, worse. Why would I want to reclaim a place among people who were so quick to condemn me?" "Because they were wrong, and now they know it," Thomas argued. "Judge Harrison's ruling cleared your name completely. You can hold your head high again." "I can hold my head high in Montana, too. Higher, actually, because the people there know me. They saw me at my lowest and helped me anyway. They didn't need a judge's ruling to believe in my worth." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "This is about that cowboy, isn't it? Elias Boone." "This is about me," Clara corrected, "about who I am and who I want to be. Yes, Elias is part of that, but it's bigger than him. It's about choosing a life that's mine instead of living up to someone else's expectations. I'm not trying to control you," Thomas said, wounded. "I just want you to have the life you deserve, the opportunities you sacrificed. I know you do, Papa, and I love you for it. But what you think I deserve and what I actually want aren't the same thing anymore." Clara took his hands, her voice gentle. "I came here to reconnect with you, not to reclaim my old life. I needed to see you, to explain what happened, to make sure you knew I was all right. But my home is in Copper Ridge now. My future is there. With the cowboy. With Elias, yes, but also with Maggie and the Silver Spur and a community that let me be myself instead of demanding I fit into a pre-made role." Clara squeezed his hands. "Come visit me there, Papa. See what I've built. Meet the people who matter to me. Maybe then you'll understand." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, and Clara saw acceptance finally settling into his features. "You really have changed, haven't you? You're not the girl I remember." "No," Clara agreed. "I'm not. That girl died the night Richard attacked her. I'm someone different now, someone stronger, I think. Someone who knows her own mind and isn't afraid to fight for what matters." "Your mother would be proud," Thomas said quietly. "She always said you had steel in you, hiding under all that silk and propriety. I see it now." The acknowledgement brought tears to Clara's eyes. "Will you come visit? I want you to see my life, Papa. Want you to know Elias properly, not just as the man who brought me home, but as the man I'm choosing to build a future with." "I'll come," Thomas promised. "Give me a few months to arrange things at the office, but I'll come, and I'll try," he smiled wryly, "to be appropriately impressed by Montana territory, even though I hear it's colder than a banker's heart." Clara laughed, the tension finally breaking. "It is. But it's beautiful too, Papa, wild and honest and real in a way this city never was for me." They returned to the party together, united if not entirely in agreement. For the rest of the evening, Clara played her role one last time. The prodigal daughter returned, gracious and polished and appropriate. But inside, she was already planning her return to Montana, to Elias and Maggie and the life she'd chosen. 2 days later, Clara and Elias stood on the platform at the San Francisco depot, their bags repacked and tickets in hand. Thomas had come to see them off, and he surprised Clara by pulling Elias aside for a private conversation while she checked their luggage. When they returned, Elias looked slightly shell-shocked, and Thomas wore an expression of grim satisfaction. "What did you say to him?" Clara demanded of her father. "Just that if he hurts you, I'll hunt him down myself, business empire or no business empire," Thomas replied cheerfully. Then his expression softened. "And that I'm trusting him with my most precious treasure, that I can see he loves you, and that," his voice grew thick, "that I'm grateful to him for keeping you safe when I couldn't." Clara hugged her father one last time, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne and committing the moment to memory. "I love you, Papa. I'll write every week, I promise. And you'll come visit in the summer?" "In the summer," Thomas confirmed. "Now go. Your train is boarding, and I'm told Montana waits for no one." As the train pulled out of the station, Clara watched her father's figure grow smaller and smaller until he disappeared entirely. She felt Elias's arm come around her shoulders, solid and reassuring, and leaned into his warmth. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. "None," Clara said, and meant it. She'd made her peace with the past, reconnected with her father, and chosen her future with clear eyes and a full heart. "Let's go home." The journey back to Montana felt different from the trip out. Where before Clara had been tense with anticipation and worry about facing her father and her past, now she felt light, unburdened in a way she hadn't experienced since before Richard Ashford had entered her life. She watched the landscape change through the train window, the coastal cities giving way to farmland, then mountains, then the wide open spaces of the frontier, and felt like she was traveling towards something instead of away from it. Elias seemed to sense her mood shift. He'd been quiet and reserved in San Francisco, clearly uncomfortable with the wealth and formality of her father's world. But as they moved farther from the city, his natural ease returned. He smiled more, joked with other passengers, and held Clara's hand openly instead of with the careful propriety he'd maintained at the Morgan house. "Feel good to be heading home?" he asked as they crossed into Montana territory, the familiar peaks of the Rockies rising in the distance. "Better than good," Clara replied. "I feel like I can breathe again. San Francisco was important. I needed to see my father, needed to face that city as a free woman. But it's not home anymore. Maybe it never really was. Your father seemed disappointed you weren't staying." "He was. But he also understood, I think. Or he will, eventually." Clara squeezed Elias's hand. "What did he say to you at the station? You never told me." Elias's ears reddened slightly. "Just father things. Asked about my intentions, warned me that you were accustomed to a certain standard of living, told me he'd make my life hell if I didn't treat you right." "He threatened you?" Clara was torn between horror and amusement. "Not threatened exactly. More like, stated facts." Elias grinned. "I liked him, actually. He loves you fiercely, even if he doesn't always know how to show it. Reminds me of my own father that way." "Tell me about your family," Clara said, realizing she knew surprisingly little about Elias's background beyond the broad strokes he'd shared. "Your mother you've mentioned, but what about siblings? Other family?" "2 sisters, both younger. Rose and Margaret, we call her Maggie, actually, which is partly why your boss felt familiar to me from the start." Elias's expression grew distant with memory. "Rose married a rancher and has 3 kids now. Maggie, my Maggie, she's a teacher in Sweetwater, smart as a whip, that one. Used to beat me at chess regularly when we were growing up." "Do they know about me?" "I wrote to them from San Francisco, told them I'd met someone, that I was planning to settle in Montana for good." He looked at her, suddenly uncertain. "Unless you want to go to Texas? I know it's warmer, and my family's there." "Montana's where we built our life together," Clara interrupted. "That's where we stay. But maybe we could visit your family sometime. I'd like to meet the women who raised such a good man." "They'd like you," Elias said with confidence. "My mother especially. She always said I needed someone who'd challenge me, keep me honest. You do both." They arrived in Copper Ridge on a bright April afternoon when the snow was finally melting and the first hints of spring were showing in the valleys. The town looked smaller than Clara remembered, more rough-hewn after weeks in San Francisco's sophistication, but it felt right in a way the city never had. This was a place where people were judged by their actions rather than their ancestry, where hard work mattered more than social connections, where Clara could be exactly who she was without pretense or performance. Maggie was waiting for them at the Silver Spur, and Clara barely had time to set down her bag before the older woman pulled her into a crushing embrace. "Thought you might not come back," Maggie said gruffly. "Thought San Francisco and your fancy father might convince you to stay." "Not a chance," Claire replied, returning the hug with equal fervor. "This is home, Maggie. Your family. I wasn't leaving that behind." "Good. Because I've been holding your position, and I'd hate to waste the effort training someone new." But Maggie's eyes were suspiciously bright, and Clara knew the older woman was more moved than she'd admit. That evening, the saloon filled with people wanting to hear about Clara's journey, and she found herself telling edited versions of her reunion with her father and her time in the city. She left out the uncomfortable moments, the society judgment, her father's initial resistance to her return to Montana. Instead, she focused on the resolution, the healing, the sense of coming full circle. "So you're really staying?" Bill Hastings asked, his weathered face creasing with pleasure. "Not going back to being a fancy city lady?" "I'm really staying," Clara confirmed, "though I suppose technically I'm still a fancy city lady, just one who prefers Montana." The celebration went late into the night, and by the time the last customer left, Clara was exhausted but happy. She helped Maggie clean up, falling into their familiar rhythm as if she'd never left, and found herself humming without realizing it. "You're different," Maggie observed, wiping down the bar. "Lighter, somehow." "I am lighter," Clara agreed. "I spent almost 2 years carrying the weight of what happened with Richard, constantly afraid of being discovered, never able to fully relax. Now that's gone. The legal threat, the constant vigilance. It's over. I can just be." "And what about the guilt?" Maggie's question was gentle but direct. "You've forgiven yourself yet for surviving?" Clara paused in her sweeping, considering. "I'm working on it. I don't think it happens all at once. Forgiveness, I mean. It's more like layers. Each day I wake up free. Each time someone looks at me and sees Clara instead of a murderer. Each moment with Elias when I remember I deserve happiness. Those are all tiny acts of forgiveness. Eventually, maybe they'll add up to the real thing." "They will," Maggie said with certainty. "You're stronger than you think, Clara. Always have been." Over the next weeks, Clara settled back into Copper Ridge life with a sense of rightness she'd never felt anywhere else. She returned to her work at the Silver Spur, but with her legal status cleared and her real identity no longer a secret, she felt free to be more fully herself. She introduced herself to new customers as Celeste, though most of the regulars still called her Clara out of habit, and stopped editing her speech to hide her education. When conversations turned to books or art or politics, she engaged freely, instead of holding back for fear of revealing too much. Elias had resumed his work at the Larson Ranch, but every evening, without fail, he appeared at the saloon. Sometimes they'd have dinner together, sometimes they'd just talk, and sometimes they'd take long walks through the town and surrounding countryside, watching winter release its grip on the land. They talked about everything and nothing, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. It was during one of these walks, on a mild evening in early May when the first wildflowers were beginning to appear, that Elias suddenly stopped walking and turned to face Clara. "Marry me," he said, the words emerging without preamble or preparation. Clara's breath caught. "What?" "Marry me," Elias repeated, taking her hands. "I know I should probably have a ring, should make a big romantic gesture, should ask your father's permission first. But I'm standing here watching the sunset with you, and I realized I don't want to spend another day without knowing you're mine, and I'm yours in every possible way. So, Celeste, Clara Morgan Wynne, whatever combination of names you want to use, will you marry me?" Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were happy tears, joyful tears, the kind that came from too much emotion contained in too small a space. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, absolutely yes." Elias whooped and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, He kissed her thoroughly, and Clara kissed him back with all the love and gratitude and hope she'd been storing up. "I don't have a ring yet," Elias said when they finally broke apart. "But I'll get you one, something worthy of you." "I don't need a ring to know you love me," Clara replied, "but I won't say no to one either." They walked back to town hand in hand, making plans. A simple ceremony, they agreed. Just close friends and whatever family could make the journey. Maggie could stand up with Clara, and Elias would ask Bill Larson to be his best man. They'd marry in the church, have a celebration at the Silver Spur, and start their life together properly. "Where will we live?" Clara asked practically. "Your room at the boarding house is barely big enough for one person, and mine above the general store isn't much better." "I've been thinking about that," Elias said. "There's a piece of land available just outside town, the old Henderson place where we confronted Mercer. The land's good, and we could build a house there. Start a ranch maybe, or just have space for horses and a garden. A real home, Celeste, one we build together." The idea of reclaiming the place where she'd faced down Jake Mercer and chosen courage over fear felt symbolically perfect. "I love it," Clara said, "though I know nothing about building houses or running ranches." "We'll learn together," Elias assured her. "That's what marriage is, isn't it? Learning how to build a life as you go, making mistakes, and fixing them together." When they shared their news at the Silver Spur that evening, Maggie cried openly and insisted on hosting the wedding celebration herself. "About time," she said, wiping her eyes. "I've been waiting for that cowboy to make an honest woman of you since he first walked through that door." But the happiness of their engagement was interrupted 3 days later when a rider arrived in Copper Ridge with news that sent a chill through Clara's heart. Jake Mercer had returned, and he'd brought friends, rough men with guns and grievances, talking loudly in the saloon over in Helena about settling scores with the people who'd run him out of Copper Ridge. Sheriff Morrison delivered the news personally, his expression grave. "My contact in Helena says Mercer's been drinking and talking big about revenge. Specifically mentioned you, Clara, and Elias. Said he's not going to let anyone make a fool of him and get away with it." "How many men does he have?" Elias asked, his voice gone cold and professional in a way Clara had never heard before. "4 that we know of, could be more." Morrison looked between them. "I can deputize some men, try to head them off before they get here. But Mercer knows this territory, knows the back trails. He could arrive tomorrow or next week. We need to be prepared." "What if we left?" Clara suggested, fear making her voice tight. "Just until this blows over. We could go to Helena ourselves, or even back to San Francisco." "Running doesn't make problems go away," Elias said gently. "It just postpones them. Besides, Mercer's not going to stop because we're not here. He'll just take his anger out on other people in town, people who helped us or stood by us. I won't let that happen." "So what do we do?" Clara demanded, frustration warring with fear. "Just wait for him to show up and start shooting?" "We prepare," Morrison said. "We make sure everyone in town knows what's coming and is ready. We set up positions, make sure we have clear sight lines, establish a signal system. And we hope Mercer comes to his senses before he does something that gets people killed." But Clara knew men like Mercer didn't come to their senses. They nursed their grievances until they festered, until violence seemed like the only remedy. She'd seen it with Richard. That sense of entitlement twisted into rage when he couldn't have what he wanted. Mercer was the same type of man, just with different targets. The next days were tense, the whole town on edge, waiting for trouble that might or might not arrive. Elias barely left Clara's side, and when he did, he made sure someone else was watching over her. Clara chafed at the protection but understood the necessity. Mercer had specifically mentioned her in his threats, and there was no telling what he might do. She kept working at the Silver Spur, partly because Maggie needed the help, and partly because staying busy kept her from dwelling on worst-case scenarios. But she was acutely aware of every customer who walked through the door, every shadow that moved outside the windows, every unexpected sound. On the 6th day after Morrison's warning, trouble finally arrived. Clara was serving lunch to a table of miners when the sound of multiple horses approaching made everyone in the saloon freeze.